My sister stood in the center of her new $850,000 living room, bragging to everyone about how she paid in pure cash. Meanwhile, my father grabbed my arm in the kitchen and whispered that my life savings were never mine to keep. They thought they had gotten away with stealing my entire inheritance, while my grandmother was dying in hospice. They had no idea that when I told my grandmother what they did, she did not cry. She just picked up the phone, called her lawyer, and set a trap that would leave my sister homeless and my parents facing federal prison. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 32 years old, a meticulous accountant who plays by the rules. Before I tell you how a single phone call from a hospice bed destroyed my family's entire fake empire, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you believe that thieves should never prosper, especially when they share your blood. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time it is there. Now let me take you to the night the lies finally caught up with them. The smell of smoked salmon and expensive dill filled the air of the sprawling Chicago suburb home. I was balancing a heavy silver tray of appetizers on one hand and clutching a stack of cocktail napkins in the other. I was not the hired help. I was the older sister. But in my family, those two roles were exactly the same thing. The house was massive, a modern colonial with vaulted ceilings, a sweeping mahogany staircase, and an open-concept kitchen wrapped in imported Italian marble. It was the kind of house that demanded attention. It was the kind of house that screamed wealth, success, and stability. And it was completely undeniably fraudulent. I moved through the crowd of well-dressed guests, offering small smiles and passing out the hors d'oeuvres my mother had demanded I prepare. Patricia. My mother was holding court near the custom stone fireplace. She wore a tailored emerald dress and held a glass of champagne, soaking in the admiration of her friends from the local country club and the senior members of our church committee. Every time someone complimented the crown molding or the hardwood floors, my mother would touch her chest and nod as if she had laid the planks herself. A few feet away stood my sister Chloe. She was 29 years old, a part-time yoga instructor who treated her occasional morning classes like they were rigorous corporate board meetings. Chloe was the undeniable golden child of the family. She had our mother's exact smile, our father's exact sense of entitlement, and a lifelong habit of simply reaching out her hand and expecting the world to place things into it. Next to her was her husband, Brad. Brad sold golf carts at a regional dealership. He was currently wearing a flashy watch that I knew for a fact was a cheap replica, and he was laughing loudly at a joke told by the head of the church finance committee. I watched them from the edge of the kitchen island, my sensible black flats aching against the tile. As an accountant, my entire life is built on the foundation of logic. Income must equal or exceed expenses. Assets must balance with liabilities. Debts demand payment. Numbers are honest. They do not care about your ego, your pride, or your desire to impress the neighbors. And the numbers in that living room were screaming at me. I knew my family's financial reality better than they did. For the past 6 years, I had been the unpaid, unappreciated bookkeeper for my parents' failing hardware store. Robert, my father, was a man of immense pride and terrible business sense. He ran the store like it was still the 1980s, ignoring inventory management and bleeding money through bad vendor contracts. Month after month, I spent my evenings sitting at my small kitchen table in my cramped apartment, untangling his mess. I balanced his payroll so his employees would not go hungry. I filed extensions with the IRS to keep the government from shutting his doors. I did it all for free because I believed that family took care of family. I also knew Chloe and Brad's financial reality. 2 years ago, Brad had bounced a check for a simple car lease. Chloe's credit cards were constantly maxed out from expensive wellness retreats and designer clothes she bought to impress women who did not actually care about her. I had seen their credit reports. Their combined debt-to-income ratio was a disaster. No reputable bank in the state of Illinois would have approved them for a conventional mortgage on a house half this size. Yet here they were standing in the middle of an $850,000 estate. I stepped closer to the living area, offering a napkin to a guest, my ears tuning into Brad's booming voice. He was swirling his wine glass, talking to a small circle of church elders. "The market is crazy right now," Brad said, puffing out his chest. "Bidding wars everywhere. But you know how it is. Cash is king. The sellers wanted a quick close, and we were in a position to bypass the bank entirely, drop the full 850 grand on the barrel. Pure cash, no mortgage, no interest, no hassle. One of the church elders raised his eyebrows in genuine impressed shock. That is a remarkable achievement for a young couple. You must have been saving incredibly diligently. Chloe placed a delicate manicured hand on Brad's arm and offered a falsely modest smile. We have been so blessed, she murmured. It took a lot of sacrifice and smart planning, but we knew we wanted a proper forever home to raise a family in. I almost dropped the silver tray. Pure cash. The words echoed in my head, bouncing against the walls of logic in my brain. It was impossible. Even if they had sold every single thing they owned, drained their non-existent savings, and emptied their retirement accounts, they could not have scraped together $50,000, let alone almost $1 million. You do not just magically manifest that kind of liquid wealth unless you win the lottery or someone dies. And nobody had died. Grandma Beatrice was currently in a hospice facility 20 miles away, fighting the final stages of a brutal illness. She was still very much alive. I felt a cold prickle of dread wash over the back of my neck. I set the appetizer tray down on a side table, my mind racing through thousands of ledger entries, bank statements, and tax documents I had processed for my parents over the years. My parents were broke. My sister was broke. I moved quietly toward the hallway, needing a moment to breathe when I caught sight of my mother standing near the arched entryway. She was speaking in hushed conspiratorial tones with Susan, the president of the country club's social committee. Susan was known for being the biggest gossip in our entire zip code. It is just so wonderful to see Chloe settled, Susan said, sipping her champagne. But really, Patricia an all-cash offer in this neighborhood. I had no idea Robert's hardware store was doing so exceptionally well. My mother offered a tight, smug little laugh. Oh, the store does fine, Susan. But Robert and I decided to be proactive. Why wait until we are gone to see our children enjoy their blessings? We decided to arrange an early inheritance for Chloe. We wanted to see her thrive while we are still here to enjoy it with her. Susan gasped softly, her eyes wide with admiration. An early inheritance. Patricia, that is incredibly generous. What a beautiful sacrifice. My mother waved her hand dismissively, though she was clearly drinking in the praise. Well, family is everything. Chloe needed a home, and we were in a position to provide it. It is just what good parents do. The hallway seemed to tilt. The ambient noise of the party faded into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. An early inheritance. My mother and father did not have an inheritance to give. They barely had enough cash flow to cover the commercial rent on their failing store. The only substantial wealth in our entire family belonged to Grandma Beatrice. Beatrice had been married to a highly successful corporate lawyer who had left her a massive estate when he passed away 20 years ago. But Beatrice was notoriously strict with her money. She despised my father's poor work ethic and had explicitly refused to fund my mother's lavish lifestyle. But there was one specific account. My chest tightened as a memory from 4 days ago hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been sorting through my own mail at my apartment when I found a strange, automated letter from a major national bank. It was addressed to me, but it referenced a custodial account. Specifically, a trust fund established under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. Grandma Beatrice had set it up for me when I was just a little girl, intending for it to grow quietly in index funds until I was ready to buy a home or start a business. Because I had been a minor when it was created, my father Robert had been named as the legal custodian. The letter was a standard automated notification of account closure. It stated that a full withdrawal had been executed and the balance had been reduced to zero. At the time, I had barely glanced at it. I assumed it was a bureaucratic error, or perhaps Grandma Beatrice had instructed my father to move the funds to help cover her escalating hospice care costs. I had never touched that money. I had never even asked about it. I was a self-sufficient adult who paid her own bills and expected nothing from anyone. I trusted my father to handle it appropriately for his dying mother. Now standing in the shadow of the mahogany staircase, staring at the marble floors of my sister's debt-free mansion, The terrifying mathematical equation solved itself in my mind. The automated letter had not listed the exact dollar amount of the withdrawal, but I remembered a conversation I had with Grandma Beatrice a year ago. We had been sitting in her garden, and she had patted my hand, telling me not to worry about my future. She had mentioned that the index funds had performed beautifully over the decades. She had said the account was nearing $900,000. $850,000 in pure cash, an early inheritance. A custodial account closed. My father was the legal custodian on paper. The realization hit my stomach like a block of lead. I felt physically sick. My hands began to shake so violently I had to grab the edge of the hallway console table to steady myself. They had not given Chloe an early inheritance from their own pockets. They had used the outdated custodial status to legally access the trust Grandma Beatrice had built for me. They had forged whatever internal family documents they needed, drained my entire life savings, and wired it directly to my sister so she could buy a house to show off to her friends. They had stolen my future to buy Chloe's present. I looked across the room. Chloe was laughing, tossing her hair back, holding a crystal wine glass. Brad was accepting a pat on the back from a neighbor. My mother was smiling serenely, accepting the praise of a community she was actively deceiving. And then I saw him, my father. Robert was standing near the kitchen island. He was not laughing. He was not bragging. He was holding a bottle of imported beer, and his eyes were locked directly on me from across the room. He saw the way I was gripping the table. He saw the color drain from my face. He knew exactly what I had just figured out. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked defiant. He set his beer down on the marble counter and gave me a sharp, commanding jerk of his head, gesturing for me to follow him into the darkened space of the caterer's prep kitchen, hidden behind the main dining room. I pushed off the table. My legs felt like they were moving underwater. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the urge to cry. What I felt was a cold, absolute rage spreading through my veins. For 6 years, I had sacrificed my evenings, my weekends, and my peace of mind to save his business from ruin. I had paid their overdue utility bills when they were short on cash. I had played the role of the dutiful, quiet, reliable daughter while they showered Chloe with endless praise and unearned rewards. I had accepted my place in the background, but I would not accept being robbed. I walked through the crowd, ignoring a guest who tried to hand me an empty skewer. I pushed through the heavy swinging door into the prep kitchen. The noise of the party was instantly muffled. The room was illuminated only by the harsh fluorescent light above the industrial sink. My father was waiting for me in the center of the room. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set ready for a fight. He thought he could intimidate me into silence just like he always did. He thought I was still the quiet little girl who would back down to keep the peace. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. The heavy stainless steel door of the prep kitchen swung shut behind me, cutting off the laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The room was stark lit only by the humming fluorescent bulb over the industrial sink. The air smelled of raw onions and catering bleach, a sharp contrast to the expensive perfume and roasted meats just a few feet away. My father stood by the metal prep table. He was a large man. A man who had spent his life trying to project an image of power he never truly possessed. He took a slow pull from his beer bottle, his eyes locked on mine. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was no fatherly concern for the fact that my hands were trembling so hard I had to press them against the side of my dress. He knew exactly why I had followed him. He had seen the realization break across my face in the hallway. I wanted him to look guilty. I wanted him to pace the floor to make excuses to tell me that the bank had made a terrible mistake. I wanted him to be the man I had spent 6 years trying to save from bankruptcy. Instead, he simply set his bottle down with a loud clack against the metal table. "What did you do?" I asked. My voice was a brittle whisper, barely audible over the hum of the commercial refrigerator. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He did not ask what I was talking about. He took a step toward me, his heavy shoes scraping against the linoleum floor. "You are making a scene, Sarah. Lower your voice and go back out there." I did not move. I thought about the letter sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about the zeros. Where is my trust fund, Dad? Where is the $850,000 Grandma Beatrice left for me? My father sighed a deep, weary sound as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a toy I was not allowed to have. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was looming over me. "You are going to keep your mouth shut," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "Tonight is about your sister. You are not going to ruin her housewarming party with your selfish drama." Selfish. The word hit me like a physical blow. I stepped back, my accounting mind racing, tearing through the legal parameters of the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. Grandma Beatrice had set up that custodial account for me when I was 7 years old. Because I was a minor, my father had been listed as the custodian. He was supposed to manage the funds until I came of age. But I was 32 years old now. By law, that money was legally mine the moment I turned 21. The bank would not just hand him a cashier's check for nearly $1 million without my explicit, notarized authorization. "You forged my signature," I said. The reality of his crime settled into my bones cold and heavy. "You forged my signature to close the account, and you wired the money directly to Chloe's escrow. That is why they could pay in pure cash. You stole my future to buy her a house." Before I could take another breath, my father lunged forward. His large, rough hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. His fingers dug into my skin, bruising me through the thin fabric of my dress. I gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. He jerked me toward him, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale hops and bitter resentment. "Listen to me very carefully," he hissed, his eyes wide and furious. "That money was never yours to keep." I stopped struggling. The sheer audacity of his words paralyzed me. "Grandma Beatrice made a mistake," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "She favored you because you were quiet, because you never asked for anything. But Chloe is building a family. Chloe has a husband. Chloe has a certain lifestyle she needs to maintain, to associate with the right people in this community. Your sister needs a home. What do you need it for? You sit alone in your apartment, crunching numbers for my store. You do not need a mansion. You do not need nearly $1 million. I stared into the eyes of the man I had called my father for 32 years. I saw no love there. I saw absolute entitlement. I spent the last 6 years of my life working every night and every weekend to save your hardware store. I whispered, my voice thick with tears I refused to shed. I balanced your books. I negotiated your vendor debts. I paid your utility bills out of my own pocket when you could not make payroll. I sacrificed my time, my energy, and my life to keep you from going bankrupt, and you steal my inheritance to buy Chloe a house she did not earn. My father scoffed a cruel, dismissive sound. Do not act like a martyr, Sarah. I let you do my books because it made you feel useful. You have always been plain. You have always been socially awkward. Chloe is the star of this family. She is the one who brings us pride. She networks with the church committee. She associates with the country club members. She elevates our family name. You just balance spreadsheets. That money is doing exactly what it was always meant to do. It is securing our family's legacy. He released my arm with a violent shove, sending me stumbling back against the heavy metal door of the walk-in freezer. I caught my balance, my arm throbbing where his fingers had dug in. That is federal wire fraud, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. That is elder financial abuse. You committed a felony. My father let out a harsh, arrogant laugh. Go ahead, call the police. Tell them your father transferred family money to your sister to buy a family home. Do you really think they will care? Do you think anyone will believe the jealous, bitter, older sister who is mad that she did not get a cut? You have no proof. The bank processed the paperwork. The title company cleared the wire. The house is in Chloe's name. It is done, Sarah. It is over. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles with practiced ease. His face transformed back into the jovial, proud father he played for the public. Now, he said, pointing a finger toward the heavy steel door that led to the back alley, you are going to leave. You are not going out the front door to cause a scene. You are going to walk out the back, get in your cheap little car, and drive home. And if you ever speak a word of this to anyone in our church or in our community, I will make sure everyone knows exactly how unstable and vindictive you are. We are done here." He turned his back on me and pushed through the swinging door, walking right back into the bright laughing crowd of my sister's housewarming party. The door swung shut, leaving me completely alone in the cold, humming kitchen. I stood there for a long time. The silence of the room pressed down on me. I looked at the tray of appetizers I had abandoned on the counter. I looked at the bruise already beginning to form on my arm. My entire life I had played the role they assigned to me. I was the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who absorbed their stress, fixed their problems, and asked for absolutely nothing in return. I thought my compliance was a form of love. I thought that if I just proved my usefulness, they would eventually see my value. But my father's words echoed in my mind. "I let you do my books because it made you feel useful." They did not love me. They had never loved me. They had simply utilized me. And the moment my utility was outweighed by a massive pile of cash, they discarded me without a second thought. They believed I was too weak to fight back. They believed I was too conditioned to obedience to ever challenge their authority. They thought they had committed the perfect crime, cleanly shifting my grandmother's wealth into their golden child's pockets while leaving me with absolutely nothing. I pushed open the heavy steel door leading to the alleyway behind my sister's new mansion. The chill of the October night hit my face instantly. It was raining a steady driving downpour that soaked my hair and my clothes the moment I stepped off the covered porch. The gravel crunched under my sensible black flats as I walked toward where my 10-year-old sedan was parked on the street. Through the massive, brilliantly lit windows of the house, I could see them. I could see Chloe laughing, holding up a glass of champagne. I could see my mother patting the expensive fabric of the new sofa. I could see my father shaking hands with a neighbor, smiling the smile of a man who believed he had secured his family's perfect future. I unlocked my car and climbed into the driver's seat. The interior was freezing. The rain drummed relentlessly against the roof and the windshield. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. The tears finally came hot and bitter, blurring my vision. I cried for the little girl who had tried so hard to be loved. I cried for the woman who had wasted 6 years of her life saving a business for people who viewed her as disposable. But the tears did not last long. The profound grief was quickly swallowed by a fierce, burning clarity. My parents had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed that because I was quiet, I was stupid. They had assumed that because I was obedient, I was powerless. They forgot that I was an accountant. They forgot that I spent my entire life tracking paper trails, following the flow of money, and finding every single discrepancy in a ledger. They thought the bank paperwork would protect them. They thought the closed account meant the money was safe in their hands. But there was one person they had not accounted for. One person who possessed a mind even sharper than mine. One person who had built that trust fund with her own 2 hands and who despised entitlement more than anything else in the world. Grandma Beatrice. My parents believed Beatrice was lying in a hospice bed, heavily medicated, completely unaware of the world outside her room. They thought she was too close to death to realize her legacy had been plundered. They believed they could wait out her final days, bury her with fake tears, and then enjoy their stolen millions in peace. I wiped the tears from my face. I reached out and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and the heater slowly began to push warm air into the freezing cabin. I shifted the car into drive. I did not turn the steering wheel toward my small, empty apartment. I did not drive home to wallow in my defeat. I pulled out onto the wet asphalt, the tires gripping the road as I accelerated into the stormy night. I bypassed the highway exit that would take me to my neighborhood. Instead, I merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the county hospice facility. My parents wanted to keep this a family secret. They wanted me to walk away quietly. But they had stolen from the wrong daughter, and they had underestimated the wrong grandmother. I drove through the dark, pouring rain, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers sounding like a countdown. I was going to tell Grandma Beatrice everything. And I knew deep in my bones that when I did, the perfect world my parents had built on my stolen money was going to burn to the ground. The rain was coming down in heavy, relentless sheets as I drove away from the sprawling, fraudulent mansion my sister now called home. The windshield wipers beat a frantic and rhythmic tempo against the glass, but they could not clear the blurry haze of my own tears. I gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan until my knuckles turned completely white. My chest felt hollowed out, scraped entirely clean by the sheer brutality of my father's words in that caterer's kitchen. He had looked me dead in the eye, his grip bruising my arm, and told me that my life savings were never mine to keep. He had justified stealing my entire future simply because my sister wanted a house she had not earned. For 6 long years, I had poured my heart and my professional skills into saving his failing hardware store from bankruptcy. I had worked late into the night, balancing his chaotic ledgers, negotiating with angry vendors, and sacrificing my own peace of mind, all for a family that viewed me as nothing more than a convenient, disposable tool. I had believed that my quiet loyalty would eventually earn their love. Instead, it had only earned their contempt. They had used an outdated legal loophole from a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act account to forge my signature. They had drained $850,000 in pure cash and wired it directly into my sister's escrow account. My years of silent sacrifice had been violently trampled under the weight of their bottomless greed. I pulled into the quiet, dimly lit parking lot of the Oak Creek Hospice Center. It was nearing 11 o'clock at night. The building was low and unassuming, bathed in the pale orange glow of security lights that reflected off the flooded pavement. I turned off the engine and just sat there for a long moment in the dark, freezing cabin of my car. I was absolutely terrified. How do you walk into the room of a dying woman and tell her that her own son is a thief? How do you look into the eyes of the grandmother who loved you and confess that the legacy she worked her entire life to build has been hijacked to fund a country club fantasy? I felt a crushing wave of guilt, as if I had somehow failed her by not protecting the account better. But I had to tell her the truth. I could not let her pass away, believing her hard-earned wealth was safely securing my future, when in reality it had been squandered on my sister's arrogance. I stepped out of the car and walked through the driving rain. The automatic sliding doors of the hospice facility opened with a soft mechanical hum. The air inside smelled of clinical lemon cleaner, fresh linens, and quiet endings. It was the exact opposite of the loud, boastful housewarming celebration I had just left behind. The nighttime reception nurse gave me a sympathetic nod as I walked past the front desk. She knew me well. I had been visiting every single day after my accounting shifts. My parents, on the other hand, had not visited in over 2 weeks, claiming they were far too busy with important business matters. Now I knew exactly what business matters they had been attending to. I walked down the long, silent hallway until I reached room 312. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently and stepped inside. Grandma Beatrice was awake. She was 78 years old, and her body was currently losing a grueling battle with advanced stage cancer. She looked incredibly frail, her small frame barely making a dent beneath the stark white hospital blankets. Intravenous lines were connected to the back of her thin, translucent hand. And a heart monitor beeped with a slow, rhythmic consistency in the corner of the room. But despite her physical deterioration, her posture retained a regal dignity. And her eyes, those piercing, intelligent blue eyes, were still the sharpest thing in the room. They missed absolutely nothing. She turned her head as I entered, a soft smile touching her pale lips. But the smile vanished the moment the dim hospital light caught my face. She saw the wetness on my cheeks, the slight tremor in my shoulders, and the absolute devastation written across my expression. I walked over to the side of her bed. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I tried to maintain my composure. I tried to be the strong, rational accountant I was trained to be. But the moment I reached her side, the emotional dam completely broke. I slid off the edge of the vinyl visitor chair and dropped straight to my knees on the cold linoleum floor. I buried my face into the edge of her mattress and began to sob. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the heavy, agonizing weeping of a child who had just realized she meant absolutely nothing to the people who brought her into the world. Grandma Beatrice did not ask what was wrong. She slowly lifted her fragile hand and placed it on top of my head, gently stroking my damp hair. She let me cry until the heavy sobs finally began to subside into ragged breaths. I lifted my head, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "Grandma, I am so incredibly sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I failed you. I did not know what they were doing until tonight." Beatrice looked down at me, her gaze steady and calm. "Tell me exactly what happened, Sarah. Leave nothing out." I took a deep, shuddering breath and laid out the entire horrific reality. I told her about the automated letter from the bank that I had dismissed as a bureaucratic error. I explained how I had been forced to serve appetizers at Chloe and Brad's lavish new housewarming party tonight. I told her how they had loudly bragged to the church committee about dropping $850,000 in pure cash to bypass the mortgage process. I explained how my mother had proudly boasted to her country club friends about providing Chloe with an early inheritance. Then I told her about the dark corner of the caterer's kitchen. I repeated the exact words my father had hissed at me when I confronted him. I told her how he had bruised my arm, looked me dead in the eye, and declared that the money was never mine to keep because my sister needed a home. I explained the legal mechanism they had exploited. Because the trust fund had been established under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, when I was just a little girl, my father had remained on the paperwork as the legal custodian. He had abused that outdated status, forged my signature to bypass the age restrictions, closed the account entirely, and wired my life savings directly to the seller of my sister's new house. I waited for the devastation to hit her. I braced myself for the tragic, tearful family moment where a dying mother realizes her son is a monster. I expected her heart monitor to spike wildly in panic. I expected her to weep for the profound moral failure of the family she had raised. Instead, the steady beeping of the heart monitor remained perfectly calm. Grandma Beatrice did not shed a single tear. She did not gasp in shock. She did not tremble with sorrow. Her expression simply hardened into absolute terrifying ice. A chilling, lethal silence filled the sterile hospital room. It was not the silence of a broken, defeated woman. It was the silence of a veteran chess player watching her opponent step willingly into a fatal trap. She slowly withdrew her hand from my hair. With a level of physical effort that made her wince, she reached toward the plastic bedside table. Her fingers closed around her cell phone. She brought the device to her face, her eyes narrowing as she navigated the screen. She found the contact she was looking for and tapped the screen to place the call. She lifted the phone to her ear and waited for exactly 2 rings. When the person on the other end answered, Beatrice spoke with a voice that commanded absolute authority. Her tone was sharp, devoid of any weakness or sickness. "Thomas, get to the hospice now. It is time for them to meet my attorney." She lowered the phone and let it drop onto the white blanket. I stared at her from my place on the floor, completely bewildered. My tears had stopped, entirely replaced by a profound, echoing confusion. "Grandma, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Beatrice looked down at me. The warmth had returned to her eyes, but it was accompanied by a fierce, protective fire. "Get up off the floor, Sarah," she commanded gently. "You are a brilliant, independent woman, and you will never kneel for those parasites again. Wipe your face and sit in the chair." I pushed myself up from the floor and sat heavily in the vinyl chair, my mind struggling to process her reaction. She was not surprised. She was not heartbroken. She was mobilized. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "I have known your father for 58 years. I know exactly the kind of man Robert is. I know he runs his business like a fool and relies on your hard work to cover his sheer incompetence. I know Patricia is a shallow, greedy woman who values country club gossip over her own daughter's well-being, and I know they have spent their entire lives treating you like a disposable servant while treating Chloe like royalty. Do you really think I would leave your financial future completely unprotected in the hands of a man who cannot even manage a neighborhood hardware store?" I shook my head slowly, trying to follow her logic. "But the money is gone, Grandma. The bank cleared the wire transfer. Chloe already holds the deed to the house. They took the $850,000. Beatrice offered a cold, calculated smile. It was a smile that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "I know they took it," she said smoothly. That was the entire point. I stared at her, my mouth opening and closing as my accounting brain tried to make sense of her words. The point. What do you mean that was the point? Beatrice shifted slightly against her pillows, folding her thin hands together over her lap. When your grandfather passed away, he left me a very substantial portfolio. I spent the last 20 years growing it quietly, watching how my family behaved. I watched Robert bleed his business dry. I watched Patricia chase status she could not afford. And I watched you, Sarah. I watched you work tirelessly, acting with complete integrity, asking for absolutely nothing, and absorbing their abuse to keep the peace. I knew that when my time came, they would try to take everything from you. They would try to manipulate the estate, challenge my will, and leave you with nothing. She paused, taking a slow breath from her oxygen cannula, before continuing. So 3 years ago, I sat down with my estate attorney, Thomas Sterling. I told him I needed a way to protect you permanently. I needed a way to ensure that Robert and Patricia could never touch my true wealth, and I needed a way to prove their unfitness in a court of law without a shadow of a doubt. Thomas and I engineered a test, a moral tripwire. My heart began to pound heavily in my chest. A test. That uniform transfers to Minors Act account was intentionally left vulnerable. Beatrice explained, her voice sharp and steady. I deliberately chose not to update the custodial paperwork when you turned 21. I left Robert's name on that specific account, knowing exactly how much money was sitting inside it. I knew that as my health declined, his panic over his own failing finances would grow. I knew Patricia would demand a way to maintain their wealthy facade. I placed $850,000 right in front of them on a silver platter, and I waited to see if they would have the wicked audacity to steal it from their own daughter. They did not just steal it. I whispered, the reality of the situation finally beginning to dawn on me. They used it to buy a house in plain sight. Exactly. Beatrice nodded, her eyes flashing with grim satisfaction. They walked right into the trap. They thought they were being incredibly clever. They thought they were exploiting a simple banking loophole. What they do not know is that the $850,000 in that account was legally bound by a secret conditional lien written directly into my overarching master trust. It was a poison pill, Sarah. I leaned forward in my chair, hanging on to her every word. A poison pill. In corporate finance, a poison pill is a defensive strategy used to prevent a hostile takeover. It makes the acquisition financially devastating for the attacker. My grandmother, a woman who had never worked a day on Wall Street, had just deployed one of the most ruthless financial tactics in existence against her own son. Thomas wrote a specific clause into my final will. Beatrice continued. The clause explicitly states that any beneficiary or legal custodian who attempts to fraudulently access, redirect, or misappropriate the funds within that specific UTMA account automatically triggers a complete and irrevocable disinheritance from the primary estate, not just for themselves, but for their entire household. She reached out and took my hand again. Her grip was surprisingly strong. They thought $850,000 was my entire legacy, Sarah. They thought they were walking away with the grand prize. They have absolutely no idea that my true estate, the commercial real estate, the municipal bonds, and the private equity accounts, is currently valued at over $6 million. And by stealing that trust fund, your father has legally and permanently forfeited their right to a single penny of it. The room was silent, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. I sat frozen, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her brilliance. My parents had sacrificed a $6 million empire for a stolen house they could not even afford to furnish. But it gets worse for them, Beatrice added, her voice dropping to a whisper. Because they used legally encumbered stolen trust funds to purchase that real estate, the property itself is now tainted. under the strict stipulations of the trust and federal tracing laws that house does not belong to Chloe. She smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes. That house belongs to your trust, Sarah. They just bought you an $850,000 piece of real estate, and they are going to be legally evicted from it the moment my will is read. The heavy rain was still violently battering the single window of the hospice room when the solid wooden door pushed open. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stood up as a man walked into the dimly lit space. He did not look like a typical late-night hospital visitor. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit that looked completely untouched by the severe storm outside. His silver hair was perfectly combed back, and his dark eyes swept across the room with the cold, calculating precision of a predator stepping into its territory. This was Thomas Sterling. He was Grandma Beatrice's estate attorney, a veteran litigator known throughout the entire state for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom and entirely devoid of mercy when it came to protecting his clients. Thomas did not offer me any empty condolences. He did not ask how anyone was feeling. He simply walked over to the bedside, placed a thick leather briefcase on the small rolling table, and looked down at my grandmother. Beatrice offered him a thin, knowing smile. He nodded in return, a silent acknowledgement between two seasoned generals preparing for a brutal war. Thomas then turned his sharp gaze to me. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice incredibly deep and gravelly. "Your grandmother has told me everything about your meticulous work ethic and your steadfast loyalty. It is a profound pleasure to finally meet you, though I deeply wish it were under much better circumstances." I shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of grounding in his absolute, unwavering confidence. Beatrice shifted weakly on her pillows, her breathing labored but steady. "Tell her, Thomas," she commanded. "Tell her exactly what her parents have done today." Thomas unlocked his briefcase with a sharp, metallic click. He pulled out a crisp legal pad and a silver pen, positioning himself under the harsh fluorescent light. "What your parents executed today is not a simple family dispute over a shared bank account." He began, his tone entirely clinical and devoid of emotion. "By utilizing an outdated Uniform Transfers to Minors Act account to completely bypass your legal authority as an adult, your father did not just commit a casual breach of trust. He committed a highly coordinated series of severe, punishable criminal offenses." He looked me dead in the eye, ensuring I grasped the absolute gravity of the situation. "When your father forged your signature on those banking documents to authorize the closure of that custodial account, he committed felony forgery. When he instructed the bank manager to transfer those funds across institutional lines directly into your sister's real estate escrow account, he committed federal wire fraud. And because he used his position of power to manipulate and drain assets intimately connected to an overarching trust designed by a vulnerable senior citizen, he is staring directly down the barrel of elder financial abuse." The words hung heavily in the sterile air of the hospice room. Felony forgery, federal wire fraud, elder financial abuse. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously following the rules, making sure every corporate ledger was perfectly balanced and every tax form was entirely compliant with the law. Hearing those massive, life-destroying legal terms explicitly attached to my own mother and father made my stomach churn with a sickening mixture of horror and vindication. They stole $850,000. Thomas continued writing a single sharp line on his legal pad. In the eyes of the federal government, they did not just buy a beautiful new home for their golden child. They executed a highly calculated, large-scale financial heist. If convicted, your father is looking at a mandatory minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. And your mother, as a willing and active co-conspirator who undoubtedly orchestrated the social cover-up, will be sitting right there in a cell beside him. My breath hitched in my throat. 10 to 15 years in federal prison. A small part of me, the deeply wounded little girl who just wanted her parents to love and protect her, felt a sudden, terrifying spike of panic. But then, my mind snapped back to the cold, arrogant look on my father's face in the dark caterer's kitchen just an hour ago. I remembered the painful purple bruise already forming on my arm where his heavy fingers had violently dug into my flesh. I remembered my mother standing in that opulent hallway, bragging to her wealthy country club friends about her beautiful sacrifice while actively using my stolen life savings to purchase her own social status. The childhood terror vanished instantly. In its place, a cold, hardened resolution settled permanently over my heart. "Then we call the police," I said, my voice surprisingly steady and clear. "We call them right now. We show the detectives the automated bank closure letter. We pull the wire transfer records from the bank opening tomorrow morning. We have them arrested tonight while they are still drinking expensive champagne and celebrating in that stolen house." I reached for my purse on the floor, fully ready to pull out my phone and dial 911. The thought of seeing flashing red and blue police lights pulling up to Chloe's massive new driveway filled me with a sudden, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. I wanted them in cold metal handcuffs. I wanted them publicly humiliated in front of the entire church finance committee and all those wealthy neighbors they were trying so desperately to impress. I wanted the world to see the monsters hiding behind their perfect suburban smiles. But before my fingers could even brush against the screen of my phone, Thomas slammed his hand down flat against the leather briefcase. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room, making me jump. "No, Thomas," said his voice, absolute, authoritative, and entirely unyielding. "You will do absolutely nothing of the sort." I froze, looking frantically from Thomas to Grandma Beatrice, desperately seeking an explanation. Beatrice simply nodded in calm agreement with her lawyer. "Why not?" I demanded, my frustration flaring hot and fast. "You just stood there and told me they committed multiple federal crimes. We have the financial proof. They stole my money." Thomas shook his head slowly, leaning forward so his face was heavily shadowed by the overhead light. "We have banking anomalies, Sarah. We do not yet have an ironclad, foolproof narrative. If you call the police tonight, your parents will hire a high-priced, sleazy defense attorney by tomorrow morning. Do you know what that attorney will do? He will spin a beautiful, sympathetic, and entirely fabricated story for the local prosecutor. He will claim this was all just a big, unfortunate family misunderstanding. He will say that your father, acting as the original custodian of the account, genuinely and innocently believed he still had the legal right to move those funds to help a family member in need. He will argue that they fully intended to pay you back over time, or worse, he will claim that you had previously given them verbal permission to use the money for your sister." Thomas paced slowly over to the rain-slicked window, looking out into the pitch-black night. Juries are notoriously soft and unpredictable when it comes to prosecuting complex family disputes. They absolutely hate sending elderly parents to federal prison over internal money matters. If your parents manage to cry in the courtroom and successfully play the victim, they might walk away with a simple slap on the wrist, a nominal fine, or a very generous plea deal for minor probation. And worse, they might drag this entire ordeal out in civil court for a decade, completely draining the remaining $6 million estate in exorbitant legal fees. I felt a tight, suffocating knot of anxiety twist in my chest. So, what exactly do we do? We just let them get away with destroying my life. We do exactly the opposite, Thomas said, turning back to face me with a dangerously sharp smile. We let them dig their own graves so incredibly deep that no defense attorney on earth can ever pull them out. To do that, we need irrefutable documented proof of their malicious intent. We need them to actively admit in writing that they took the money knowing full well it was yours, that they did it specifically to benefit your sister, and that they have absolutely no remorse for their actions. He walked back to the bedside table and tapped his silver pen deliberately against his legal pad. Right now, your parents think they have completely won. They think you are a weak, submissive, defeated little girl who will just swallow this monumental abuse to keep the family peace. They think you are far too scared to ever fight back against their authority. We are going to use their own toxic arrogance directly against them. I looked over at Grandma Beatrice. Her bright blue eyes were burning with a fierce, protective light that gave me an immense surge of courage. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas leaned in extremely close, his presence demanding my total focus. You are going to go back to being the quiet, compliant, and invisible daughter. You are going to let them believe they successfully broke your spirit tonight. When they inevitably demand more favors from you, when they push you to help them furnish that massive empty house because they are secretly, completely broke, you are going to play the ultimate victim. You are going to act helpless, hurt, and desperate for their approval. You are going to intentionally provoke them into a state of rage. And as you well know, when narcissistic people get angry, they get reckless. You will communicate with them exclusively through text messages and emails. You will push their buttons until they put their abuse, their profound entitlement, and their clear admission of grand theft directly into writing. The mere thought of purposely playing the victim made my skin crawl with revulsion. For 32 long years, I had been exactly that, the reliable doormat, the invisible servant, the scapegoat. To voluntarily step back into that humiliating role, to willingly subject myself to my mother's toxic manipulation and my sister's arrogant demands, felt like willingly walking backward into a prison cell. I hated the idea of giving them the satisfaction of seeing me defeated. I hated the idea of letting Chloe look down on me from her stolen pedestal for even one more minute. But as I looked at my grandmother, using the very last reserves of her failing strength to legally and financially protect my future, I knew I could not let my personal pride ruin our one chance at achieving absolute catastrophic justice. This is going to be a game of extreme psychological warfare. Sarah Thomas warned softly, sensing my hesitation. They will try to crush your spirit all over again. They will try to make you feel completely worthless. You have to endure it with a smile. You cannot break character. Every cruel text message they send is another iron nail in their legal coffin. Every arrogant demand they make is another piece of golden evidence for the federal prosecutor. Can you do this? I closed my eyes and thought about the dark, freezing caterer's kitchen. I thought about the throbbing bruise on my arm. I thought about the 6 agonizing years I had wasted saving a hardware business for people who would gladly watch me burn to ashes if it kept my sister warm. I took a deep, steadying breath, intentionally, letting the cold, calculating logic of a seasoned accountant wash over the raw, bleeding pain of a discarded daughter. The ledger of my life needed to be balanced, and I was finally going to collect every single debt they owed me. Yes, I said, opening my eyes. My voice was completely stripped of all emotion, sounding just as ruthless and lethal as the veteran attorney standing in front of me. I can do it. I will play their game, and I will get you everything you need. Thomas smiled again, a sharp, highly dangerous expression that promised absolute ruin. Good. Because once we have those written confessions secured, I will personally ensure that your parents and your precious sister lose absolutely everything they hold dear. They wanted to play with fire. We are going to give them a blazing inferno. 4 days passed since the stormy night I sat in the sterile hospice room with Grandma Beatrice and attorney Thomas Sterling. 4 agonizing days of pretending that my entire world had not been violently ripped apart by the people who were supposed to love me. I did exactly what Thomas instructed me to do. I played the role of the defeated, submissive daughter. I went to work at the local logistics firm, processed my spreadsheets, and returned to my cramped one-bedroom apartment. Every time my phone rang and I saw my mother or father on the caller ID, I answered with a quiet, broken voice. I apologized for walking out of the party early. I let them lecture me about family loyalty and the importance of supporting my sister. I swallowed my pride and let them believe they had completely crushed my spirit. It was the hardest acting job of my entire life, but every time I felt like screaming, I thought about Grandma Beatrice. I thought about the poison pill she had legally embedded into my stolen trust fund. On a rainy Tuesday evening, I was sitting at my small laminate dining table, reviewing a client tax file, when a rapid, demanding knock rattled my front door. I checked the peephole. It was my sister Chloe. She was standing in the dim, flickering light of my apartment hallway, wearing a pair of expensive designer yoga pants and an oversized cashmere sweater. She looked incredibly annoyed, tapping her manicured fingers against her expensive leather purse. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, instantly slipping into my required role. "Chloe, what are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice low and timid. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, stepping into my small living room. She wrinkled her nose as she looked at my secondhand sofa and the cheap rug covering the scuffed floorboards. "It smells like boiled cabbage in here." "Sarah," she complained, waving a hand in front of her face. "Anyway, I do not have time to sit down. I am in the middle of a massive crisis and you need to help me." I closed the door, my heart starting to pound with anticipation. Thomas had predicted this. He had told me that their bottomless greed would make them reckless. "What kind of crisis?" I asked cautiously. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh, pacing across my small living room as if she were the ultimate victim of a terrible tragedy. "It is the new house," she said, throwing her hands up in the air. "It is a complete disaster, Sarah. We have a massive formal dining room, a gorgeous open-concept living area, and a huge master suite, but we have absolutely nothing to put in them." The house echoes every time we speak. I am hosting the Church Women's Auxiliary Brunch next month, and I cannot have them sitting on folding chairs like we are some kind of college students. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by her profound lack of self-awareness. She had just used my stolen life savings to purchase an $850,000 mansion in pure cash, and now she was standing in my cheap apartment complaining that her stolen mansion echoed. "Furniture is expensive," I said quietly, playing my part. "You and Brad will just have to save up and buy things slowly over time." Chloe glared at me like I had just suggested she forage for food in a dumpster. "I am not buying cheap particle board garbage from a discount store, Sarah. We hired a high-end interior designer from the country club circle. She quoted us $50,000 to furnish the main entertaining areas and the master bedroom. It is a completely reasonable price for custom pieces." "So pay her," I replied, keeping my hands perfectly still at my sides. Chloe crossed her arms, suddenly looking defensive and agitated. "We cannot pay her right now. Brad maxed out his credit cards last month, buying his new golf simulator, and my cards are carrying a balance from the country club initiation fees. We went to the bank yesterday to take out a $50,000 personal loan, but the underwriter declined it. They said our debt-to-income ratio is too high." She huffed, rolling her eyes at the supposed injustice of basic financial mathematics. "It is completely ridiculous. We own an $850,000 home free and clear. You would think they would bend over backward to lend to us." I knew exactly why the bank declined them. A paid-off house meant nothing to an underwriter when you had zero liquid assets, massive revolving credit card debt, and a mediocre income from selling golf carts. They were house-rich and cash-poor, drowning in a lifestyle they could not sustain. "I still do not understand why you are telling me this," I said softly, though I knew exactly where this was going. Chloe stepped closer to me, putting on a sickeningly sweet smile. It was the exact same smile she used when we were children, right before she blamed me for something she had broken. "Because you are an accountant, Sarah. You have no debt, you have no life, and you have a pristine credit score. I need you to co-sign the $50,000 furniture loan for us. The bank already said that if we bring in a qualified co-signer with excellent credit, they will approve and fund the loan by Friday." The sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand physically stunned me. She was standing in the very apartment I was forced to rent because they had stolen my inheritance, demanding that I take on $50,000 of high-interest debt just so she could buy custom velvet sofas to impress her gossiping friends. I remembered Thomas Sterling's instructions. I had to play the victim. I had to make them angry. I had to force them to put their entitlement in writing. "Chloe, I cannot do that," I said, letting my voice waver with manufactured fear. $50,000 is a massive amount of money. If you and Brad miss a single payment, the bank will come directly after me. It will ruin my credit. I could lose my job if my financial licenses are compromised. Chloe's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, ugly sneer. "Are you seriously doing this right now, Sarah? Are you really going to be this selfish? I am your sister. I am trying to build a beautiful home for my future children, and you are worrying about your stupid little credit score. I just do not have the money to back up a loan like that. I pleaded, taking a step back to appear intimidated. You know I do not have any savings left. I added that last sentence deliberately, a subtle loaded reminder of what they had just stolen from me. Chloe's face flushed bright red with fury. You are unbelievable, she screamed, her voice echoing off the thin walls of my apartment. Mom and Dad told me you were throwing a pathetic pity party about the house, but I thought you would at least have the decency to help family when we actually need it. You are completely useless. She pulled her phone out of her expensive purse and jabbed the screen aggressively. I am calling Mom. She said you would pull a stunt like this. Chloe stormed out of my apartment, slamming the front door so hard, the picture frames on my wall rattled. I stood in the middle of my living room, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the trap to snap shut. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate on the dining table. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Patricia. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves, and answered the call. Hello? I said softly. What is wrong with you? My mother demanded immediately, not bothering with a greeting. Her voice was shrill, dripping with toxic, manipulative rage. Your sister is sitting in her car crying because you coldly refused to help her furnish her home. Have you completely lost your mind, Sarah? Mom, she wants me to take on $50,000 of debt. I stammered, pouring every ounce of fake panic I could muster into my voice. I cannot afford to pay that if Brad loses his job. It is too much risk. Risk? Patricia shrieked through the speaker. We are your family. You owe us your absolute gratitude for raising you, for putting food on your plate, for tolerating your difficult, plain personality all these years. We let you do the accounting for your father's store because we felt sorry for you. And this is how you repay us. By abandoning your own sister in her time of need. I am not abandoning her, I cried softly into the receiver. I just do not understand why she needs custom furniture when you guys just took all my money for the house. Why can she not just buy cheaper things? Because Chloe represents this family in the community, my mother spat venomously. She associates with people who matter. You sit in a cheap apartment with cheap furniture because that is where you belong. You are an accountant, Sarah. You do not need nice things. You do not need a massive trust fund. We made an executive family decision to put a roof over your sister's head, and you will respect that decision. I closed my eyes, savoring the absolute perfection of her arrogance. She was practically handing me the evidence, but spoken words on a phone call were simply hearsay in a court of law. I needed the ink. I needed the digital paper trail. I needed her to type those exact words into a medium that Thomas Sterling could project onto a screen in front of a federal judge. Mom, please, I sobbed, making my voice sound completely broken and overwhelmed. You are yelling at me, and my head is spinning. I cannot process all of this over the phone. I feel like I am having a panic attack. Please, just hang up. I will not hang up, she screamed. You are going to drive to the bank tomorrow and sign that loan document. I cannot think straight. I cried out, interrupting her. I cannot talk to you when you are screaming at me. Just text me. Text me exactly what you expect me to do and why I have to do it, and I will read it when I can breathe. Please, Mom. Just text it to me so I can understand my obligations. Before she could scream another word, I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I dropped the phone onto the laminate table and stared at the dark screen. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my body. The room was totally silent. I watched the digital clock on my microwave tick by. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Would she do it? Would her boundless narcissistic rage overpower her basic common sense? At exactly 4 minutes, my phone lit up with a notification chime, an incoming text message from my mother. I picked up the device and opened the text thread. My eyes scanned the glowing bubbles, reading the words she had furiously typed out in her blind, entitled anger. You are an ungrateful, selfish disappointment. The first text read, You will go to the bank tomorrow morning and sign as the primary guarantor for Chloe's $50,000 furniture loan. That is an absolute order. A second text popped up immediately after. You want to know why you have to do this? Because you owe this family for putting up with you. Yes, your father and I took the $850,000 from your trust account. We signed the custodial papers and we wired it to Chloe's escrow because she deserves a proper house and you do not. That money was wasted sitting under your name. We made a parental decision to reallocate family wealth to the daughter who actually brings us pride. A third text arrived, sealing her fate completely. If you do not sign that loan tomorrow, you are completely cut out of this family forever. We will erase you from our lives, just like we erased your name from that bank account. Do not test me, Sarah. You are nothing without us. I stared at the glowing screen, my breathing slow and steady. I read the words again, letting the sheer weight of her confession settle into my mind. She had admitted to taking the money. She had admitted to forging the custodial papers. She had admitted to wiring it to Chloe's escrow. And she had done it all while aggressively attempting to extort $50,000 of credit from me through emotional blackmail. I did not cry. I did not feel a single shred of sorrow for the woman who had birthed me. I simply took 3 separate high-resolution screenshots of the entire text thread. I uploaded the images directly to a secure cloud server, and then I forwarded the entire conversation to attorney Thomas Sterling. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a reply from Thomas. It contained only 2 words. Checkmate. Proceed. The trap had officially snapped shut. I set my phone down on the table, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction wrap around my heart. My mother thought she was delivering an ultimatum that would force me back into submission. She had absolutely no idea she had just signed her own federal prison sentence and handed me the keys to my sister's brand new mansion. The morning after I secured my mother's written confession, I sat at my desk at the logistics firm where I worked my day job. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the Chicago skyline looking washed and cold. I had a stack of quarterly tax estimates to process for my corporate clients, but my mind was completely consumed by the impending legal war. My parents thought they had won. They thought they had forced me back into submission with their cruel text messages. They had no idea that I had forwarded every single word of their toxic extortion to Thomas Sterling. I was an accountant, and accountants do not believe in leaving loose ends. For 6 years, I had managed the financial books for my father's failing hardware store. I had the login credentials for every bank account, every vendor portal, and every line of credit associated with his business. I had intended to formally sever my access that morning. I wanted to wipe my hands clean of their mess and let them face the impending IRS audits completely blind. I logged into the hardware store's primary banking portal to download the final ledger, intending to send it to my father with my formal resignation letter. But the moment the dashboard loaded on my screen, my breath caught in my throat. The numbers were completely wrong. Just 3 days ago, the business operating account had barely $5,000 in available cash. My father was chronically behind on paying his suppliers, but now the screen displayed an available balance of nearly $200,000. I blinked, leaning closer to my monitor. I knew every penny that flowed in and out of that store. A sudden influx of $200,000 was financially impossible unless he had secured a massive high-interest commercial loan. I quickly clicked on the Recent Transactions tab. My eyes scanned the digital ledger, searching for the source of the funds. There it was. A second mortgage had been taken out against the physical building of the hardware store itself. My father had leveraged the only legitimate asset he possessed to secure a massive line of credit. He had mortgaged his entire livelihood. But why? He had already stolen $850,000 from my trust fund to buy Chloe her ridiculous mansion. He did not need $200,000 to keep the store running. He was planning something else, something incredibly expensive and highly immediate. I refreshed the page and looked at the pending outbound wire transfers. My blood ran completely cold. There was a pending outgoing wire for $150,000. The payee was a limited liability company named Vanguard Legal Defense Group. I immediately opened a new tab on my browser and searched the name. Vanguard Legal Defense Group was not a standard corporate law firm. It was a highly specialized, incredibly aggressive legal practice operating out of downtown Chicago. They were notorious in the financial district. They did not handle contract disputes or standard civil litigation. They specialized in hostile estate takeovers, contested conservatorships, and highly aggressive elder law disputes. They were the kind of lawyers you hired when you wanted to legally strip a vulnerable senior citizen of their human rights and seize complete control of their assets. My hands began to shake violently over my keyboard. I opened my father's business email account. I still had the administrative password from when I set up his digital filing system 2 years ago. I knew it was a massive invasion of privacy, but we were far past the point of polite family boundaries. They had stolen my future. I was not going to let them steal anything else. I searched his inbox for the name of the law firm. A dozen emails populated the screen, all exchanged within the last 48 hours. I clicked on the most recent email thread. It was a detailed strategy outline sent by a senior partner at Vanguard Legal Defense Group directly to my father. I read the words on the screen, and my heart physically ached with the sheer magnitude of their evil. The email outlined a comprehensive, ruthless legal strategy. My parents were not just trying to cover up the theft of my trust fund. They were going after the entire $6 million prize. The attorney had drafted an emergency court petition. The goal of the petition was to have Grandma Beatrice declared legally incompetent by a superior court judge. They were actively citing her advanced cancer, her heavy hospice medication, and fabricated claims of her mental decline as absolute proof that she could no longer manage her own affairs. They were filing for emergency total conservatorship. The attorney explicitly instructed my father that if the judge granted the emergency petition, Robert would be immediately appointed as the sole legal conservator of Beatrice's entire estate. He would be granted absolute, unchecked authority over every single bank account, every piece of real estate, and every investment portfolio she possessed. I sat frozen in my ergonomic office chair, the air completely leaving my lungs. The sheer cruelty of their plan was suffocating. They were not waiting for my grandmother to pass away. They were actively trying to legally erase her while she was still breathing. They were using the hardware store as collateral to pay a ruthless attorney to strip a dying woman of her fundamental dignity. My mind, trained to forecast catastrophic financial risks, immediately calculated the terrifying implications of this legal maneuver. If my father successfully convinced a judge that Beatrice was legally incompetent, he would gain absolute control over the $6 million before she even took her last breath. The poison pill Beatrice and Thomas Sterling had designed to protect me would be completely neutralized. If Robert became the legal conservator, he could rewrite her entire estate plan. He could legally invalidate her final will and testament. He could deliberately drain her private equity accounts and funnel the millions directly into offshore accounts or fake corporate entities. And worst of all, he could completely erase the paper trail of the $850,000 he had stolen from me. As the conservator, he would have the power to retroactively approve the fraudulent wire transfer he had made to Chloe. He could legally classify the stolen money as a legitimate familial gift, entirely wiping out the federal wire fraud and elder financial abuse charges Thomas was preparing to file. My parents would win. They would keep the mansion. They would steal the remaining $6 million. They would leave me with nothing, and they would leave Grandma Beatrice to die as a legally silenced, helpless prisoner to their bottomless greed. The court date for the emergency petition was listed at the very bottom of the email. It was scheduled for this coming Monday morning. We had less than 72 hours. I did not waste a single second. I did not care about the tax estimates sitting on my desk. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed Thomas Sterling's direct number. The phone rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. "Thomas." I said, my voice tight and breathless. "We have a massive problem. They are making a move for the entire estate right now." I quickly and precisely relayed every single detail I had uncovered. I told him about the $200,000 loan against the hardware store. I told him about the massive pending wire transfer to the Vanguard Legal Defense Group. I explained the emergency petition for conservatorship and the fabricated claims of Grandma Beatrice's mental incompetence. I read the court date to him directly from the screen. For a brief moment, there was absolute silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Thomas breathing, his brilliant legal mind rapidly processing the catastrophic threat my parents had just initiated. When he finally spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who had spent decades destroying people in courtrooms. "Your father is significantly more desperate than I anticipated," Thomas said smoothly. "Hiring Vanguard is a bold, highly expensive move. They are incredibly dangerous litigators, Sarah. If they get front of a sympathetic judge on Monday morning and present a fabricated medical narrative, they could successfully freeze the entire estate before the sun goes down." "What do we do?" I asked, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. "If he gets that conservatorship, he wipes out the fraud. He takes everything. He takes her dignity." "He will not take a single thing," Thomas replied, his tone hardening into absolute steel. "Because we are going to blindside them before they even step foot inside that courtroom." How I pleaded. "The hearing is on Monday. It is Thursday morning. We are completely out of time." "We do not need until Monday," Thomas stated firmly. "We are going to launch a preemptive legal counteroffensive right now, but we cannot do it from our offices. The only way to stop an emergency incompetence petition is to provide the court with immediate, overwhelming, and undeniable proof of absolute mental clarity. We need to completely destroy their narrative before the judge even reads their petition." Thomas began issuing rapid, precise orders. "Sarah, leave your office immediately. I am contacting a trusted emergency superior court judge whom I have known for 20 years. I am also calling an independent board-certified geriatric psychiatrist. We are all converging on the hospice facility within the hour." I stood up from my desk, my mind racing. A judge, a psychiatrist, at the hospice. "Yes," Thomas said, anticipating my confusion. "If your father wants to play legal games with a dying woman, we are going to bring the entire legal system directly to her bedside. We are going to conduct a formal, legally binding competency hearing right in her room, fully recorded and documented before your parents even know what hit them." I grabbed my coat and my purse, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I practically ran to the elevator, ignoring the confused looks of my coworkers. The stakes had never been higher. My parents were no longer just trying to steal money. They were trying to steal my grandmother's legal voice. They were trying to declare her insane so they could pillage her life's work while she watched helplessly from a hospital bed. I drove through the busy Chicago traffic with a singular, burning focus. The rain had started again, coming down in a light, persistent drizzle. I did not care about the speed limits. I did not care about the risk. Every second that passed was another second my parents were closer to securing their fraudulent petition. I pulled into the parking lot of the Oak Creek Hospice Center, my tires screeching slightly on the wet pavement. I threw the car into park and sprinted toward the main entrance. The quiet, sterile atmosphere of the facility felt entirely different today. It felt like a battleground. I pushed through the sliding glass doors and hurried down the familiar hallway toward room 312. I did not know exactly how a bedside competency hearing worked, but I knew I had to be there to protect the woman who had spent her entire life trying to protect me. I would not let my parents win. I would not let Chloe keep her stolen mansion, and I would certainly not let my father strip away my grandmother's dignity. The race against time had officially begun, and I was ready to bring the entire fake empire crashing down. The rain was still falling in a steady, freezing drizzle when I pulled into the parking lot of the Oak Creek Hospice Center. I turned off the engine, taking one deep breath to steady my racing heart before I stepped out into the cold morning air. We were completely out of time, but Thomas Sterling had promised me a preemptive strike, and I trusted him entirely. I walked through the sliding glass doors and hurried down the quiet, sterile hallway toward room 312. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stopped dead in my tracks. The standard hospice room had been transformed into a makeshift federal courtroom. Thomas Sterling stood near the window, his posture radiating quiet, calculated menace. Next to the small rolling bedside table sat a woman with a portable stenographer machine, her fingers resting lightly on the keys ready to record every single word. A dignified man with silver hair and a heavy black judicial robe folded neatly over his arm sat in the vinyl visitor chair. This was Judge Arthur Hughes, a veteran of the Superior Court. Beside him stood Dr. Evans, the board-certified geriatric psychiatrist Thomas had promised to bring. And then there was Grandma Beatrice. She was not wearing the faded cotton hospital gown from yesterday. She was propped up against her pillows, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse. Her silver hair had been perfectly brushed, and she wore a touch of soft rose lipstick. Despite the intravenous lines still connected to her frail hands, she did not look like a dying patient. She looked like the formidable matriarch of a powerful dynasty holding court from her bed. "Sarah, come in and close the door," Thomas said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute authority. "We are expecting your parents and their legal counsel at any moment. The front desk nurse has been instructed to send them directly back here." I walked over to the side of the bed and took my grandmother's hand. It was cold, but her grip was surprisingly firm. She looked up at me with those piercing blue eyes and offered a sharp, confident nod. "We are going to end this today," she whispered. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway. The door swung open without a knock. My father, Robert, walked in first. He was wearing his best Sunday suit, clutching a thick manila folder against his chest. My mother, Patricia, followed closely behind him. She was already holding a crumpled tissue to her eye, shedding theatrical crocodile tears for the benefit of anyone watching. She sniffled loudly, playing the role of the devastated, loving daughter-in-law. Forced to make a tragic medical decision. Behind them strode a tall, slick-looking man in an incredibly expensive pinstriped suit. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and wore an arrogant, dismissive smirk. This was the attorney from Vanguard Legal Defense Group. They had come to serve the emergency court petition. They had come to legally declare my grandmother insane and seize absolute control of her $6 million estate. They walked 2 steps into the room and froze completely. The arrogant smirk vanished from the Vanguard lawyer's face the moment he saw Thomas Sterling and the court reporter. My mother dropped her tissue, her mouth falling open in sheer bewilderment. My father stared at the crowd of professionals, his eyes darting frantically around the small room as his brain desperately tried to process why his secret legal ambush had been anticipated. "What is the meaning of this?" the Vanguard lawyer demanded, stepping forward and puffing out his chest. "We are here on a private family matter regarding the medical competency of Beatrice Jenkins. I must ask all unauthorized personnel to clear this room immediately." Judge Hughes stood up from the vinyl chair. He slowly unfolded the heavy black robe from his arm and slipped it over his shoulders, right there in the sterile hospice room. He walked to the foot of the bed and looked directly at the slick attorney. "I am Judge Arthur Hughes of the Superior Court," he said, his voice booming with unmistakable judicial power. "I received an emergency docket request this morning regarding a petition for immediate conservatorship over the patient in this room. Since you clearly intended to bring this matter to my courthouse on Monday, I decided to save everyone the trip. This emergency competency hearing is now officially in session, and every word spoken is on the legal record." My father turned the color of old ash. He looked at my mother, who was entirely paralyzed with shock. They had planned to blindside a helpless old woman. Instead, they had walked straight into a fully operational legal firing squad. The Vanguard lawyer swallowed hard, completely losing his arrogant posture. "Your Honor," he stammered frantically, opening his briefcase to pull out his documents. "We filed that petition because my clients have deep, agonizing concerns about Mrs. Jenkins's cognitive decline. She is in hospice care. She is on heavy narcotic pain management. She is highly vulnerable to manipulation. We have reason to believe she is no longer capable of managing her vast financial portfolio and requires an immediate conservator to protect her assets from undue influence." He shot a glaring, venomous look in my direction, clearly implying that I was the one manipulating her. Judge Hughes did not even look at the lawyer's paperwork. He turned his attention entirely to the woman sitting upright in the hospital bed. "Mrs. Jenkins," the judge asked gently, Can you please state your full name and your date of birth for the court record? Grandma Beatrice sat up a little straighter. Her voice was thin due to her failing lungs, but it was absolutely steady, carrying a tone of crystal clear intelligence. My name is Beatrice Evelyn Jenkins. I was born on October 14th, 1947. Thank you, the judge continued. Can you tell me what today's date is and who is the current president of the United States? Beatrice answered both questions instantly and flawlessly. My mother shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, her hands twisting the damp tissue into knots. Mrs. Jenkins, the petition filed by your son alleges that you are severely confused and entirely unaware of your own financial reality, the judge said, pulling a pen from his pocket. Can you please explain the current extent and approximate value of your personal estate? The Vanguard lawyer crossed his arms, looking smug once again. He clearly believed that an elderly woman dying of cancer would not have a firm grasp on a massive, complex financial portfolio. He thought she would stumble, hesitate, and prove his case for him. Beatrice offered a cold, terrifying smile. She did not look at the judge. She looked directly into my father's eyes. My primary estate is currently valued at slightly over $6.2 million, Beatrice stated with razor-sharp precision. I hold $2.4 million in tax-free municipal bonds managed by the firm of Harrison and Vance. I own 3 commercial real estate properties in the downtown corridor, entirely free and clear of any mortgages, generating a combined monthly rental income of roughly $40,000. I have $1.5 million in diversified private equity accounts. And until 4 days ago, I was the sole funder of a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act custodial trust account valued at exactly $850,000, which my son Robert recently drained using forged authorization documents. The room went deathly silent. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys, capturing every single devastating syllable. My father physically stumbled backward, hitting the heavy wooden door behind him. His eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The Vanguard lawyer dropped his pen on the floor. He looked at his clients with a mixture of pure shock and rising fury, realizing instantly that they had lied to him about the nature of the money they used to pay his massive retainer fee. Beatrice did not stop. She did not give them a single second to recover. She raised her frail, shaking finger and pointed it directly at my father. You stand in my room and question my mental competence, she said, her voice rising with a furious, commanding power that seemed impossible for a dying woman. You want to be the legal conservator of my estate. You are the only person in this room who is entirely financially incompetent, Robert. You run your hardware store like a complete fool. You have not paid your primary suppliers in 4 months. You have been illegally commingling your personal expenses with your business accounts to hide your failing cash flow from the bank. And just 3 days ago, you secretly took out a highly illegal predatory second mortgage of $200,000 against a commercial property that is already drowning in unpaid property taxes. The Vanguard lawyer stepped forward, holding his hands up in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Your Honor, I object. This is wild speculation and entirely irrelevant to the medical petition at hand. Overruled. Judge Hughes snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. The proposed conservator's financial history is highly relevant to his fitness to manage a $6 million estate. Continue, Mrs. Jenkins. I gave my granddaughter Sarah the administrative access to review your corporate books. Beatrice continued, staring a hole straight through my father's soul. I know exactly what you have done. I know you have been systematically evading federal payroll taxes for the last 3 quarters. I know you stole your own daughter's life savings to buy a house for a sister who refuses to work. You did not file this emergency petition today to protect me, Robert. You filed this petition because you are desperate to seize my $6 million to cover up your massive federal tax fraud and your grand theft before the IRS kicks your front door down. My father was visibly sweating now. Huge drops of perspiration rolled down his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to make an excuse, but no words came out. He was completely trapped, pinned to the wall, by his own mother's brilliant, ruthless exposure of his entire fraudulent life. My mother was openly weeping now, Not the fake theatrical tears she had brought into the room, but real humiliated tears of absolute panic. Dr. Evans, the geriatric psychiatrist, stepped forward and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I have conducted a thorough 2-hour psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Jenkins this morning. She is entirely lucid, perfectly oriented to reality, and possesses an exceptionally high level of executive functioning. The medical claims in the petition filed by her son are completely baseless and entirely fabricated." Judge Hughes turned his heavy, furious gaze toward the vanguard lawyer. The attorney physically shrank under the intense judicial scrutiny. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You have brought a malicious, frivolous, and entirely unverified petition into my jurisdiction. You attempted to use the authority of the court to strip a brilliant, fully competent woman of her fundamental human rights based on deliberate lies provided by clients who are apparently engaged in massive financial fraud." "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, taking a large step away from my parents as if their guilt were a contagious disease. "I was completely unaware of the financial discrepancies. My clients assured me the medical decline was severe and factual." "Then you failed to do your basic due diligence." Judge Hughes fired back. "I am throwing this petition out immediately with extreme prejudice. It is completely denied. Furthermore, Counselor, I am issuing a formal warning on the record. If you ever bring a case this poorly researched and highly malicious into my courtroom again, I will personally file a request for heavy disciplinary sanctions against your license with the State Bar Association." The lawyer nodded quickly, his face flushed with professional humiliation. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely. I will be formally withdrawing as legal counsel for Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins immediately." He did not even look at my parents. He simply turned on his heel, grabbed his expensive briefcase, and practically ran out of the hospice room, abandoning them to the catastrophe they had created. Judge Hughes stood up, taking off his black robe. "The official hearing is concluded," he announced to the court reporter. He looked over at Grandma Beatrice and offered a respectful, dignified bow of his head. "It has been a privilege to hear you speak today, ma'am. I wish you peace in your remaining time." "Thank you, Your Honor." Beatrice replied softly, the fierce energy slowly leaving her fragile body as the adrenaline faded. The judge, the psychiatrist, and the court reporter quietly packed up their materials and exited the room, leaving only Thomas Sterling, my grandmother, me, and the two people who had destroyed my childhood. My father stood frozen against the door. He looked utterly broken, stripped of all his arrogant power, his fake wealth, and his ridiculous pride. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of mercy, begging me to save him one last time. But I was no longer his unpaid servant. I was the woman who had helped build the legal trap that just ended his life. "You have absolutely nothing left. Robert, Grandma," Beatrice whispered, her voice tired but incredibly final. "You have lost your business. You have lost my estate. You will likely lose your freedom when the federal auditors arrive next week. And worst of all, you have permanently lost the only daughter who actually loved you enough to try and save you." My mother let out a loud, pathetic wail, hiding her face in her hands as she finally realized the absolute destruction of their country club fantasy. "Get out of my room," Beatrice commanded, closing her eyes, "and do not ever come back." My father did not argue. He did not yell. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed my mother's arm, and pulled her out into the hallway. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, sealing them outside in the cold and leaving me inside with the family I had finally chosen. I sat back down in the vinyl chair, holding my grandmother's hand, feeling a wave of absolute escalating satisfaction wash over my soul. The fake empire had fallen, and true justice had finally been served. 2 days after the extraordinary bedside courtroom confrontation, the brutal storm that had battered Chicago finally broke. The morning sun poured through the single window of room 312 at the Oak Creek Hospice Center, casting a warm golden glow across the sterile linoleum floor. I sat in the same vinyl visitor chair I had occupied for weeks, holding Grandma Beatrice's frail, translucent hand in mine. The heavy, chaotic energy of the legal ambush had completely dissipated, leaving behind a profound and sacred quiet. Beatrice was resting peacefully against her pillows. The aggressive fire that had fueled her during the hearing with Judge Hughes had gently burned out, replaced by a deep, serene acceptance. Her breathing was very shallow now, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest barely visible beneath the thin white hospital blanket. The doctors had told me the previous night that her heart was finally giving out. The sheer willpower she had summoned to legally execute my parents and secure my future had been her final magnificent act of love. I traced the delicate veins on the back of her hand, my heart heavy with an agonizing mixture of profound grief and infinite gratitude. I had spent my entire life feeling like a disposable burden in my own family, a quiet accountant whose only value was balancing the books for people who despised me. In a single afternoon, Beatrice had completely rewritten my reality. She had shown me what it actually meant to be protected. She had shown me that blood means absolutely nothing without loyalty, and that true family is built on respect, not exploitation. Beatrice slowly opened her eyes. The piercing blue color was slightly faded, but the absolute clarity of her mind remained perfectly intact. She looked at me, a soft, tired smile touching her pale lips. "You look exhausted, Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the quiet hum of the heart monitor. I offered a watery smile, refusing to let my tears fall and burden her final moments. "I am fine, Grandma. I am right here. I am not going anywhere." She squeezed my fingers with the very last ounce of strength she possessed. "You are a brilliant woman, Sarah. You have always been the best of us. Do not ever let Robert or Patricia make you feel small again. When the time comes to finish this, do not show them an ounce of mercy. They made their choices. Now you must let them face the absolute ruin they built for themselves. Do you understand me?" I nodded, swallowing the heavy lump in my throat. "I understand, Grandma. I promise you I will not back down. I will see this all the way through to the very end." Beatrice closed her eyes, a look of absolute peace settling over her weathered features. She took one long, slow, shuddering breath, and then the gentle rising of her chest stopped completely. The heart monitor let out a long, continuous tone, signaling the end of an era. The most formidable, brilliant woman I had ever known was gone. I sat there in the quiet morning light, holding her hand, long after the nurses came in to respectfully confirm her passing. I allowed myself exactly by an hour to weep, 1 hour to mourn the only parent I had ever truly had. Then I dried my eyes, stood up, and prepared myself for the grotesque circus I knew was about to begin. I made the required phone call to my father 10 minutes later. I kept my voice perfectly flat and professional, informing him that his mother had passed away. He did not ask how it happened. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply grunted into the receiver, told me to stay put, and said he and Patricia were on their way to handle the logistics. When Robert and Patricia walked into the hospice facility 2 hours later, they did not look like grieving children. They walked with a bizarre, elevated sense of arrogance, their heads held high, projecting the specific kind of confidence reserved for people who believe they have just won the lottery. Patricia was wearing her expensive country club trench coat, holding a designer leather planner against her chest. Robert was already barking orders into his cell phone, aggressively coordinating with a local funeral director. They had completely convinced themselves that the bedside hearing 2 days ago was merely a temporary setback. In their deeply delusional, greedy minds, they believed that because the judge had blocked the emergency conservatorship, the original terms of the estate would simply default to Robert as the only living son. They genuinely thought Beatrice was too traditional to completely disinherit her own blood. They believed the $6 million fortune was safely theirs, and they were ready to start spending it immediately. Patricia swept past me in the hallway without offering a single word of comfort. She did not even look into room 312 to say a final goodbye to the woman who had birthed her husband. Instead, she marched straight to the nurse's station, slammed her leather planner on the counter, and demanded a copy of the death certificate for estate processing purposes. Robert cornered the hospice administrator near the elevators, loudly discussing the transfer of the remains. He ordered the most expensive solid mahogany casket the funeral home offered. He explicitly instructed them to spare absolutely no expense, casually mentioning that the estate would be covering all the costs. I stood quietly against the wall, my arms crossed, watching them dig their financial grave with breathtaking speed. I knew for a fact they did not have the cash to cover a $30,000 luxury funeral. They were putting every single expense on their high-interest credit cards, fully assuming they would just reimburse themselves with Beatrice's millions by the end of the month. I did not stop them. I remembered my promise to Beatrice. I played the quiet, submissive accountant, observing their absolute madness with icy, calculating resolve. The true grotesque display unfolded 5 days later on the afternoon of the memorial service. My parents completely ignored Beatrice's written instructions for a quiet, intimate church service. Instead, they hijacked the entire event and transformed it into a flashy, extravagant public relations spectacle at the Oak Hills Country Club. They rented out the grand ballroom, the largest and most expensive venue the club had to offer. It was a sickening display of manufactured grief designed entirely to flaunt their perceived upcoming wealth to the local elite. When I drove my 10-year-old sedan up the winding manicured driveway of the country club, I was genuinely repulsed by the sheer scale of the absurdity. They had hired private valet attendants for the guests. The entrance to the grand ballroom was flanked by massive, towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids and rare lilies that must have cost thousands of dollars alone. I walked through the heavy double doors into the venue wearing a simple, inexpensive black dress I had bought years ago. The room did not look or feel like a funeral. It looked like a high society gala. A professional string quartet was set up in the corner, playing upbeat classical background music. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black vests circulated the room, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne flutes and high-end hors d'oeuvres. And in the very center of the room, positioned right next to the mahogany casket, was an actual massive ice sculpture carved into the shape of a grand piano, a tasteless homage to Beatrice's love for classical music. I stared at the ice sculpture, rapidly calculating the total cost of this ridiculous circus in my head. Between the venue rental, the premium open bar, the luxury catering, the imported flowers, and the mahogany casket my parents had easily blown through $80,000. They were drowning themselves in catastrophic debt to impress people who did not even care about them. Patricia was holding court near the open bar, wearing a brand new custom-tailored black designer morning dress that clearly still had the luxury department store tags hidden inside. She was holding a champagne flute, smiling serenely as she accepted condolences from the wives of the church committee members. It is just so devastating. Patricia sighed loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the room. But Beatrice lived a very full life, and Robert and I are just so incredibly blessed to step into the role of managing her vast legacy. It is a heavy burden preserving such a massive estate, but family must step up to these responsibilities. She was actively telling anyone who would listen that she was about to become a millionaire. She was securing her social status, banking entirely on money she was never going to see. Across the room, Chloe and Brad were putting on their own disgusting performance. Chloe was wearing a tight, inappropriate black cocktail dress, dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She was surrounded by her friends from the local yoga studio, dramatically recounting how hard the last few weeks had been on her emotional well-being. Brad was standing next to her, completely ignoring the solemn nature of the event, actively handing out his business cards to the wealthy older men in the crowd, trying to secure golf cart sales while standing less than 30 feet from his grandmother-in-law's casket. I felt a sharp burning wave of disgust rise in my throat. This entire family was a parasitic infection, feeding off the memory of a woman they had profoundly disrespected in life. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I needed to remain completely invisible. I needed to let them enjoy their final moments of absolute arrogance before the inevitable execution. The reading of the will was scheduled for tomorrow evening. The trap was fully set. I just had to survive this afternoon. I walked quietly toward the front of the grand ballroom, aiming for the rows of padded chairs set up for the brief memorial speech. The front row was specifically designated for the immediate family. There were 4 chairs placed behind a velvet rope. I moved to take the seat on the far left, intending to sit quietly and pay my silent respects to Grandma Beatrice. Before I could even step past the velvet rope, a large hand clamped down hard on my elbow, physically jerking me backward. I stumbled slightly in my cheap flats and looked up. My father was standing there, his face flushed with anger, his eyes narrowed into furious, commanding slits. He leaned down his face so close to mine I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Where do you think you are going?" he hissed, keeping his voice low so the surrounding guests could not hear the venom in his tone. "I am going to sit down for the service," I said evenly, keeping my face entirely blank. "I am her granddaughter." "You are a massive embarrassment to this family," Robert sneered, his grip tightening on my arm. "You tried to ruin your sister's housewarming party with your selfish, pathetic jealousy. You have been walking around this entire week acting like a victim. You do not belong in the front row. You do not belong with the immediate family." He pointed a thick finger toward the very back of the massive ballroom, toward a section of cheap folding chairs set up near the kitchen doors for the catering staff and the distant acquaintances. "You are going to walk to the back of this room, and you are going to sit in the shadows where you belong," he commanded, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Today is about projecting strength and unity to our community. I will not have my business partners looking at your miserable plain face in the front row. Chloe and Brad will sit with your mother and me. Now turn around and walk away before I have security escort you off the premises." I looked at him. I did not argue. I did not shed a tear. I simply stared into his arrogant, cruel eyes and memorized every single detail of his face in that exact moment. I wanted to remember the absolute certainty he felt right now. I wanted to burn this memory into my brain so I could compare it to the look of sheer apocalyptic terror he was going to display tomorrow night when Thomas Sterling pulled the floor out from under his entire life. "Okay," I said quietly. My voice was utterly devoid of emotion. I pulled my arm out of his grip, turned on my heel, and walked away from the front row. As I walked down the center aisle, I made eye contact with Chloe. She was standing near the front, watching our father cast me out of the family section. She offered me a slow, victorious, sickeningly sweet smirk. She thought she had won. She thought she had secured her place as the wealthy, beloved golden child, while the discarded older sister was banished to the shadows. I did not react. I walked all the way to the back of the room, found a folding chair near the swinging kitchen doors, and sat down in complete silence. The service began. My father stood at the podium, shedding fake tears and delivering a plagiarized generic speech about love and legacy. My mother dabbed her dry eyes for the audience. Chloe held Brad's hand, playing the devastated granddaughter perfectly. The country club guests nodded in sympathy, entirely fooled by the expensive flowers and the mahogany casket. I sat in the back row, completely isolated, treated like an absolute outcast by my own blood. But as I sat there in the shadows listening to their lies, I did not feel small. I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, terrifying power thrumming through my veins. They thought I was sitting in the back because I was weak. They thought they had successfully erased me from the family hierarchy. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting in the back simply because I wanted the best possible view to watch their entire fake empire burn to ash. The execution was imminent. The reading of the will was exactly 24 hours away, and I held the match that was going to ignite the poison pill. I folded my hands in my lap, offered a silent prayer of thanks to Grandma Beatrice, and waited for tomorrow to come. The morning after the grotesque spectacle at the country club, the heavy, suffocating silence in my cheap apartment was broken by the sharp chime of my cell phone. It was an email from attorney Thomas Sterling. He had officially initiated the final phase of Grandma Beatrice's master plan. He had sent a formal legal notice of the will reading to every named party, including my parents and my sister. But Thomas had not scheduled the reading at his downtown law firm. He had not booked a neutral conference room. Instead, he had explicitly mandated that the reading of the final will and testament must take place inside Chloe's new $850,000 house. I read the digital document carefully, marveling at the sheer calculated genius of Thomas Sterling. He had cited a highly specific, legally binding clause from Beatrice's overarching trust. The document stated that it was the deceased's final irrevocable wish that her legacy be unveiled in the very home that her life's work had provided for her family. To my parents and my sister, this mandate looked like the ultimate blessing. It looked like a profound post-mortem validation of their horrible choices. They genuinely believed that Beatrice had forgiven them, that she had accepted the fraudulent wire transfer as a necessary family expense, and that she was using her dying wish to formally anoint Chloe's new mansion. They were so blinded by their own bottomless greed that they could not see the massive legal guillotine hanging directly over their heads. I knew exactly how they were reacting in that moment. I could easily picture my mother, Patricia, sitting at her kitchen table sipping her morning coffee and smiling that smug, victorious smile. I could imagine her calling her country club friends, bragging that her mother-in-law had specifically chosen Chloe's beautiful new estate for the formal reading of the $6 million will. I could picture my father, Robert, puffing out his chest, feeling completely vindicated. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone. He thought his panicked attempt to declare Beatrice legally incompetent was just water under the bridge, a minor misstep that had been washed away by her death. He thought he was about to be handed the keys to a financial empire. And Chloe. Chloe was probably spinning in circles, absolutely thrilled that she got to host the most important financial event in our family's history. She would see this as her crowning achievement, the final undeniable proof that she was the golden child, the chosen one, the daughter who mattered most. They had no idea that Thomas had mandated the location for one specific devastating reason. He wanted them sitting in the exact physical center of their crime when he dropped the federal hammer. He wanted the walls of that stolen house to bear witness to their absolute destruction. The reading was scheduled for 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. I spent the entire day preparing myself mentally and emotionally. I did not want to walk into that house looking like the defeated, invisible accountant they had abused for 32 years. I wanted to walk in looking like the woman my grandmother had raised me to be. I chose a tailored navy blue blazer and a crisp white blouse, the exact same outfit Beatrice had worn during her final magnificent stand in the hospice room. I pulled my hair back into a neat professional knot. I looked in the mirror and promised myself that I would not shed a single tear today. The time for mourning was over. Today was about justice. At exactly 4:15, Thomas Sterling pulled up to my apartment building in his sleek black town car. I walked outside and climbed into the passenger seat. The interior of the car smelled of expensive leather and quiet authority. Thomas looked over at me, his dark eyes sharp and completely unreadable. "Are you ready for this, Sarah?" He asked, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet cabin. I nodded, keeping my hands perfectly still in my lap. "I have been ready for this for 6 years, Thomas. I just want it to be done." Thomas put the car in drive and we merged onto the highway. We drove in silence for a long time, watching the gray, overcast sky stretch across the city. The rain from earlier in the week had finally stopped, leaving the air feeling heavy and thick with anticipation. "Your father called my office 3 times this morning," Thomas said casually, keeping his eyes on the road. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He asked my paralegal if he needed to prepare any specific tax documents to facilitate the immediate transfer of the primary investment accounts. He is under the delusion that he will be walking out of that house tonight with direct access to $6 million. I let out at a harsh, dry laugh. He actually thinks you are just going to hand him a blank check after what he tried to pull at the hospice center. "Arrogance is a terminal disease," Sarah Thomas replied smoothly. "It blinds people to the most obvious realities. He believes that because he is the only surviving son, the law will naturally default to his favor. He believes that blood automatically entitles him to the throne. He is about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between biological entitlement and legal reality." We turned off the main highway and entered the exclusive gated community where Chloe had purchased her home. The neighborhood was sickeningly perfect. Massive sprawling estates sat far back from the road, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and towering oak trees. This was a place for doctors, lawyers, and corporate executives. It was not a place for a failing hardware store owner and his unemployed daughter. The very fact that they had dared to buy a house in this zip code using my stolen trust fund was a testament to their absolute detachment from reality. Thomas pulled the black town car up to the long, sweeping driveway of Chloe's new house. I stared at the structure through the passenger window. It was a massive, modern farmhouse design with bright white siding, dramatic black trim, and a sweeping wrap-around porch. It was exactly the kind of house you saw on the cover of luxury lifestyle magazines. And every single brick, every single window, and every single blade of grass had been purchased with my life savings. We stepped out of this car. The evening air was crisp and biting. Thomas grabbed his heavy leather briefcase from the back seat. The satisfying metallic click of the latch closing sounded like a weapon being loaded. He looked at me, gave a single sharp nod, and we walked up the wide concrete path to the massive mahogany double doors. We did not even have to knock. The door swung open immediately. My mother, Patricia, stood in the grand entryway, wearing a tight, inappropriate cocktail dress and holding a crystal glass of red wine. She had a wide, completely unearned smile plastered across her face. "Thomas." She practically purred, stepping forward to shake his hand. "We are so incredibly honored to have you here. Please come in. Make yourself comfortable. Can I get you a drink? We have a lovely Cabernet open." "I am fine, Mrs. Jenkins," Thomas replied coldly, completely ignoring her outstretched hand. He stepped past her into the foyer without breaking his stride. Patricia's fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. She finally turned her gaze to me, looking me up and down with obvious disdain. "Oh, Sarah, you made it. I am surprised you did not wear black. I suppose you are still processing your grief in your own strange little way. Just try not to bring the mood down today, all right? We are celebrating a legacy." I did not say a word. I simply stepped past her, following Thomas into the belly of the beast. The interior of the house was a visual assault of desperate, frantic spending. Just a few days ago, when Chloe had come to my apartment demanding that I co-sign a $50,000 loan, she had complained that this massive house was completely empty. Now, the echoing halls had been violently stuffed with high-end luxury furniture. The grand open concept living room was dominated by two massive custom-curved velvet sofas in a bright, obnoxious shade of emerald green. A highly polished imported marble coffee table sat in the center of the room, adorned with an absurdly large arrangement of white roses. The walls were covered in abstract, mass-produced art that looked like it belonged in a corporate hotel lobby. They had clearly gone on a massive, uncontrolled shopping spree, swiping their high-interest credit cards until the plastic melted, fully banking on the $6 million inheritance to pay it all off tomorrow morning. The sheer financial recklessness of it made my head spin. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded, actively lighting their own parachutes on fire. My father, Robert, was lounging comfortably on one of the green velvet sofas. He was wearing a casual, expensive-looking cashmere sweater and holding a tumbler of scotch. He looked completely relaxed, like a king surveying his newly conquered domain. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass ice cubes, clinking softly. "Thomas," my father called out, raising his glass in a mock salute. "Welcome to Chloe's new home. Beatrice would have absolutely loved this place. I know she would have been so incredibly proud to see her family stepping up in the world. It is exactly what she always wanted for us." I felt my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. The absolute gall of the man. He was sitting on credit card-funded furniture inside a house bought with stolen money, raising a glass to the mother he had tried to declare legally insane just a week ago. Chloe and Brad were sitting on the opposite sofa. Chloe was wearing silk loungewear, sipping her own glass of red wine and scrolling through her phone. She barely even looked up when we walked in. She was completely immersed in her own manufactured reality, already mentally spending the millions she thought were coming her way. Brad was leaning back with his arms crossed behind his head, looking like a man who had just won the lottery without buying a ticket. Thomas walked directly to the center of the room. He did not sit down. He did not accept their offers of hospitality. He stood tall and commanding, placing his heavy leather briefcase directly onto the polished marble coffee table. The thud of the briefcase hitting the stone echoed loudly in the high-ceilinged room, instantly killing the casual, celebratory mood. I stood 2 feet behind Thomas, crossing my arms over my chest. I kept my face entirely blank. I channeled every ounce of professional distance I had learned in my years of corporate accounting. I was not the terrified weeping girl on the hospice floor anymore. I was not the invisible sister serving appetizers in the back kitchen. I was the silent, observing witness to a financial execution. "Please, have a seat, Thomas." My father insisted, his confident smile wavering just slightly as he noticed the lawyer's rigid posture. "We have plenty of room. We just had these pieces delivered this morning." "I prefer to stand." Mr. Jenkins Thomas said, his voice dropping to that lethal gravelly register that signaled absolute danger. "The matters we are here to discuss today are highly specific and completely unalterable. This will not take long." Patricia hurried over from the foyer, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floors. She took a seat next to my father, smoothing her dress and putting on her best attentive expression. Chloe finally put her phone down, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Brad sat up straight, suddenly looking a little less comfortable in his silk shirt. They were all staring at the leather briefcase on the marble table. They were practically salivating. I could see the greed shining in their eyes. They were completely convinced that inside that briefcase were the legal documents that would finalize their wealth. They thought Thomas was going to open it, read a few traditional legal phrases, and hand them the keys to a $6 million kingdom. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at the sister who had happily participated in stealing my entire future. They were lounging confidently, pouring expensive wine, basking in the warm, golden glow of their own toxic arrogance. They had absolutely no idea that the room they were sitting in did not belong to them. They had no idea that the money they had stolen was legally poisoned. They had no idea that the document inside that briefcase was not a blessing, but a heavily engineered, legally flawless death warrant. Thomas Sterling placed both of his hands on the brass latches of the briefcase. He did not break eye contact with my father. "We are here today by the explicit final mandate of Beatrice Evelyn Jenkins." Thomas announced, his voice echoing perfectly through the large, lavishly furnished living room. She requested that this reading take place exactly here in this specific house so that there could be absolutely no misunderstanding regarding the final disposition of her estate. My father smiled widely, nodding in complete agreement. Of course, she wanted to bless our new family home. It is a beautiful gesture. I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with the cold, chilling authority of an executioner waiting for the signal to drop the blade. I did not say a single word. I did not have to. The trap was perfectly set. The victims had willingly walked inside and locked the door behind themselves. All that was left to do was for Thomas Sterling to open his briefcase and let the absolute devastating truth tear their perfect, fraudulent world to shreds. Thomas pushed the brass latches. They popped open with a sharp, heavy click. "Let us begin," Thomas said, and the room went completely silent. Thomas Sterling stood in the exact center of my sister's massive, echoing living room. He placed both of his hands flat against the polished brass latches of his heavy leather briefcase. The room was so completely silent that I could hear the expensive grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My father Robert was leaning forward on the obnoxious green velvet sofa, his hands clasped together in eager anticipation. My mother, Patricia, sat beside him, swirling her expensive red wine, her face radiating a smug, victorious warmth. Chloe and Brad were practically vibrating with excitement on the opposite sofa. They all believed this was their crowning moment. They believed they were about to inherit the world. Thomas pushed the brass latches down. They popped open with a sharp, heavy click that sounded like a lock snapping shut on a prison cell. He reached inside and slowly withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was bound with a heavy, red wax seal, bearing the official crest of his law firm. He held the envelope up so that everyone in the room could see it clearly in the bright light of the crystal chandelier. "This is the final legally binding will and testament of Beatrice Evelyn Jenkins." Thomas announced, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that commanded absolute authority. As her appointed executor and legal counsel, it is my sworn duty to execute her final wishes exactly as they are written. Thomas broke the red wax seal. The crisp cracking sound echoed off the high ceilings. He pulled out a thick stack of heavy parchment paper and adjusted his reading glasses. He began reading the standard legal preamble. He confirmed Beatrice's identity, her sound mind, and the revocation of all prior wills. My parents nodded along, completely impatient. They did not care about the legal formalities. They only cared about the money. Let us move directly to the disposition of the primary estate, Thomas said, turning to the third page. At the time of her passing, the total valuation of Beatrice Jenkins's primary estate, including all municipal bonds, commercial real estate holdings, and private equity accounts, was officially assessed at $6.2 million. A loud collective gasp erupted from the green velvet sofas. My father's eyes widened to the size of saucers. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, letting out a sharp, joyful squeal. Chloe grabbed Brad's arm and shook it violently, her face lighting up with pure, unadulterated greed. They had absolutely no idea the estate was that massive. They thought the $850,000 they had stolen from my trust account was the grand prize. Hearing the words $6.2 million sent them into an absolute frenzy of arrogant celebration. Patricia looked at Robert with tears of joy shining in her eyes. "We are rich, Robert," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We are completely set for life. We can buy the vacation home in Aspen. We can upgrade the country club membership." Chloe practically jumped up from her seat. "We can pay off the furniture loan tomorrow morning," she cheered, looking at Brad with wild excitement. "We can hire the landscapers to finish the backyard immediately." I stood perfectly still behind Thomas, keeping my arms crossed and my face entirely devoid of emotion. I watched them celebrate their imaginary wealth. I watched them mentally spend millions of dollars that did not belong to them. It was the most pathetic, grotesque display of human greed I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Thomas did not smile. He did not offer any congratulations. He simply raised his large hand, demanding total silence. The room instantly quieted down. My parents leaned forward again, ready to hear how the millions would be distributed into their bank accounts. However, Thomas continued, his voice turning incredibly cold and sharp. "The primary estate is governed by a highly specific set of conditions established by a master trust. We will now proceed to Clause 7 of the final will and testament." He turned to page 12. I watched my father's confident smile begin to slightly waver. He recognized the tone in the lawyer's voice. It was the same tone Thomas had used in the hospice room just days before. Clause 7 reads as follows. Thomas announced, projecting his voice, so every word landed like a physical blow. "Prior to my passing, I established a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act custodial account for the sole benefit of my granddaughter, Sarah Jenkins. The total value of this specific account was exactly $850,000. My mother's arrogant smile vanished instantly. Her face went completely blank. Chloe stopped moving on the sofa. My father swallowed hard, his hands tightly gripping the knees of his expensive cashmere trousers. They knew exactly what account Thomas was talking about. It was the exact account they had illegally drained to buy the very house we were currently standing inside. As the legal grantor of this trust, Thomas continued reading from the parchment. I intentionally attached a hidden conditional legal tripwire, specifically known as a conditional lien, directly linking that custodial account to my primary $6 million estate. The color began to rapidly drain from my father's face. He was a terrible businessman, but he understood basic financial terminology. He knew what a lien meant. The conditions of this tripwire are absolute and irrevocable. Thomas read, his eyes sweeping across the terrified faces of my family. Any legal custodian, beneficiary, or family member who fraudulently accesses, redirects, or misappropriates the funds within that specific $850,000 account without the express, legally notarized consent of Sarah Jenkins will immediately and automatically trigger their own complete disinheritance. This disinheritance applies not only to the offending individual, but extends permanently to their entire household and any associated heirs. The silence that followed those words was absolutely suffocating. It felt as though the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the massive living room. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the hallway, counting down the final seconds of their wealthy facade. Thomas lowered the document and looked directly at my father. To put it in plain English, Robert, if you stole Sarah's money, you legally forfeited your right to inherit a single penny of the $6 million estate. Patricia shot to her feet, her crystal wine glass slipping from her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of pieces, sending dark red wine splashing across the expensive rug. She did not even look at the mess. Her face was chalk white, contorted into a mask of pure, absolute panic. "That is completely insane," Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "We are her family. You cannot just disinherit blood over a simple banking misunderstanding. We were the legal custodians of that money. We had every right to move those funds to secure a home for our other daughter." Thomas smoothly reached into his heavy leather briefcase. He did not argue with her. He simply pulled out a thick stack of printed documents and tossed them aggressively onto the polished marble coffee table. The paper slid across the smooth stone, coming to a stop directly in front of my mother's expensive shoes. "There is absolutely no misunderstanding here," Mrs. Jenkins Thomas stated with lethal precision. "What you see on that table is the official time-stamped bank record showing that Robert fraudulently forged Sarah's signature to close the account. Next to it is the wire transfer log proving the stolen funds were routed directly to the title company for this property." My father looked down at the documents, his entire body shaking. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death certificate. "And right on top of those banking records," Thomas added, gesturing to a bright color printed page, "is the ironclad proof of your malicious intent." My mother looked down at the color printout. It was a high-resolution screenshot of the exact text messages she had sent me just days ago when she was trying to force me to co-sign Chloe's furniture loan. Thomas picked up a copy of the screenshot and read it out loud for the entire room to hear. "Yes, your father and I took the $850,000 from your trust account. We signed the custodial papers and we wired it to Chloe's escrow because she deserves a proper house and you do not." Thomas dropped the paper back onto the marble table. "You explicitly admitted to redirecting the trust money in writing, Mrs. Jenkins. You admitted to forgery. You admitted to federal wire fraud. And you admitted to elder financial abuse. You provided us with a flawless, irrefutable written confession." Patricia let out a loud hysterical wail. She backed away from the coffee table, her hands pulling at her perfectly styled hair. "No," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She tricked me. Sarah baited me into sending those messages. She set me up. She is a jealous, spiteful liar." I stepped forward from behind Thomas. I looked at the woman who had treated me like a useless burden for my entire life. I did not feel an ounce of pity. "I did not set you up, Mom," I said quietly, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I simply let you be exactly who you are. Your own toxic arrogance trapped you. You thought you were invincible. You thought you could treat me like garbage and face zero consequences. You were wrong." But Thomas Sterling was not finished. He turned his attention to Chloe and Brad, who were sitting completely paralyzed on the emerald green sofa. Chloe's face was completely devoid of color. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. "Now, we come to the matter of this specific real estate property," Thomas announced, pulling one final document from his briefcase. Chloe's eyes widened in sheer terror. "What about my house?" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas placed the document on the table. "It is a fundamental principle of federal anti-money laundering regulations and standard trust law that stolen funds can be legally traced to their final destination," he explained clinically. "Because your father took legally encumbered trust money and wired it directly to the title company to purchase this specific property, the transaction is legally tainted. This house was bought with stolen assets." He looked directly at Chloe, delivering the final catastrophic blow. "Under the ironclad stipulations of Beatrice's master trust, any asset purchased with misappropriated funds automatically defaults entirely to the original victim. Therefore, the deed to this $850,000 house does not belong to you, Chloe. It legally and completely belongs to Sarah's trust." Chloe's jaw dropped open. She looked around the massive, echoing living room, staring at the high ceilings, the expensive light fixtures, and the giant marble fireplace. The reality crashed down upon her with the force of a falling building. The house she had been bragging about to all her friends, the house she had used to elevate her social status, was not hers. She was sitting inside my house. "Oh my God!" Brad suddenly shouted, jumping up from the sofa and grabbing his hair. He looked at Chloe with wild, manic panic in his eyes. "The furniture loan." Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She collapsed back onto the green velvet sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The truth had finally hit her. They had just used their own personal credit to take out a massive $50,000 loan to buy custom velvet sofas, marble tables, and luxury beds for a house they were going to be legally evicted from. They were completely homeless, and they were drowning in catastrophic furniture debt that they had absolutely no way to repay. Brad turned on my father, his face turning bright red with rage. "You told us this money was clean," Brad screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Robert. "You told us this was an early inheritance. You completely ruined my life. I am going to have to file for bankruptcy because of your stupidity." My father did not answer. He simply sat on the sofa, staring blankly at the floor, his entire world completely reduced to ashes. The $6 million was gone. The hardware store was failing. The house was gone. He had absolutely nothing left. It was time for the final purge. I walked around the marble coffee table and stopped directly in front of my parents. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. I looked down at my father. "For 6 years, I did the accounting for your hardware store," I said softly. "I saw every single illegal transaction. I saw you mixing personal funds with business accounts. I saw you ignoring the federal payroll taxes. And I saw the massive $200,000 fraudulent second mortgage you took out last week to hire that sleazy defense lawyer." I dropped the first manila envelope directly into my father's lap. "As a certified accounting professional, I have a strict legal and ethical obligation to report gross financial misconduct," I explained. Inside that envelope is a formal subpoena from the Internal Revenue Service. They are initiating a full comprehensive forensic audit of your entire business spanning the last 6 years. They know about the second mortgage. They know about the unpaid taxes. My father let out a low, pathetic moan, letting his head fall back against the velvet cushions. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner to finally pull the lever. I turned to my mother and dropped the second manila envelope on the table in front of her. "That is your formal notification from the federal prosecutor's office," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "They have officially opened a criminal investigation into federal wire fraud and elder financial abuse. The text messages you sent me have already been submitted as primary evidence. I highly suggest you use whatever credit you have left to hire a very good criminal defense attorney." I stepped back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas Sterling. I looked around the room one last time. The arrogant facades had been completely annihilated. The country club dreams were shattered into a million pieces. They were drowning in massive debt, facing imminent homelessness, and staring directly at severe federal prison time. They had absolutely destroyed their own lives simply because they believed I was too weak to fight back. The official eviction took place exactly 72 hours after the reading of the will. I did not attend in person. I did not need to. Thomas Sterling handled the logistics with the cold and clinical efficiency of a seasoned professional. He later described the scene to me in vivid detail, and I could picture every single moment of their absolute humiliation perfectly in my mind. It was a bright and sunny Tuesday morning in that exclusive gated community. The neighborhood was quiet and serene, filled with wealthy professionals leaving for work in their luxury cars. That perfect silence was abruptly shattered by the arrival of 3 county sheriff vehicles. They pulled directly into the long, sweeping driveway of the $850,000 house my sister had stolen. The red and blue lights flashed brightly, reflecting off the pristine white siding and the expensive custom black trim. The officers knocked on the massive mahogany double doors and presented Chloe and Brad with the immediate court-ordered eviction mandate. The property legally belonged to my trust, and they were officially trespassing. Chloe completely lost her mind. Thomas said she threw a massive screaming tantrum right there on the manicured front lawn. She demanded that the officers call her father. She demanded that they arrest Thomas. She shrieked that there had been a terrible legal mistake and that the house belonged to her. The officer simply stood there completely unmoved by her wealthy, suburban performance and told her she had exactly 1 hour to pack her personal belongings and vacate the premises, or she would be arrested for criminal trespassing. The neighbors, the very same wealthy doctors and corporate executives that my mother and sister had been trying so desperately to impress, came out onto their porches to watch the spectacle. They watched as Chloe, the self-proclaimed golden child of our family, was forced to drag black plastic garbage bags filled with her designer clothes out to Brad's car. They watched Brad practically hyperventilating on the sidewalk, knowing that the $50,000 worth of custom emerald green velvet sofas and imported marble tables they had purchased on credit had to be left behind. The house and everything bolted down inside it was seized. Chloe and Brad drove away from that neighborhood with absolutely nothing but their clothes and a catastrophic mountain of high-interest debt. They had no home, they had zero savings. They had completely destroyed their credit scores for a country club fantasy that lasted less than a single month. They ended up moving into a cheap, cramped motel on the outskirts of the city, drowning in legal bills and blaming each other for their total financial ruin. Meanwhile, the consequences for my parents were far more severe and infinitely more permanent. The day after the will reading, the Internal Revenue Service executed their forensic audit on my father's hardware store. Because I had handed over the complete and unedited accounting ledgers, the federal agents knew exactly where to look. They found the years of unpaid payroll taxes. They found the illegal commingling of personal and business funds. They found the predatory second mortgage he had fraudulently secured to hire that sleazy defense attorney. Within 48 hours, the federal government placed heavy padlocks on the doors of the hardware store. The business was completely liquidated and forced into absolute unrecoverable bankruptcy. My father lost his entire livelihood in the blink of an eye, but the financial destruction was only the beginning of their nightmare. The federal prosecutor's office moved forward with the criminal charges of wire fraud and elder financial abuse. My mother's explicit, furious text messages proved to be the ultimate nail in their collective coffin. She had documented her own crime perfectly. She had admitted to taking the trust money, forging the documents, and wiring the funds to Chloe simply because she felt entitled to do so. As the criminal indictments became public record, the social facade my mother had spent her entire life building completely collapsed. The news of their arrest spread through their wealthy social circles like a wildfire. The Church Finance Committee, the very people my parents had bragged to about paying cash for a mansion, immediately voted to strip my mother of all her volunteer positions. They were completely shunned by the congregation. The ultimate blow came from the country club. For years, my mother had treated that club like her own personal kingdom, looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her. When the board of directors learned of the federal fraud charges and the elder abuse indictment, they permanently revoked my parents' membership. Thomas Sterling told me that my mother actually tried to show up at the club dining room for a lunch date a few days after the news broke, desperately pretending that everything was fine. The general manager publicly stopped her in the lobby and escorted her out the front doors in front of all her former friends. The humiliation was absolute and complete. My parents were left sitting in their house, staring at each other in terrified silence, waiting for their federal trial dates. The $6 million estate was completely gone. Their reputation was completely destroyed. They were facing years in a federal penitentiary. They had sacrificed absolutely everything for greed, and in the end, they were left with absolutely nothing. As for me, the legal dust finally settled about 2 months later. The probate court officially validated Grandma Beatrice's final will and testament, recognizing the activation of the poison pill clause. My parents and my sister were legally barred from ever contesting the estate. The entire $6 million portfolio, including the municipal bonds, the commercial real estate, and the private equity accounts, was securely and permanently transferred into my name. The deed to the massive house Chloe had tried to steal was formally handed over to my trust. I immediately put the property on the market and sold it to a nice young couple, converting the tainted house back into clean liquid assets. For the first time in 32 years, I was completely safe. I did not have to balance the books for a failing business. I did not have to serve appetizers to people who despised me. I did not have to make myself small and invisible just to survive the emotional abuse of my own family. I packed up my cheap, cramped apartment on a quiet Sunday morning. I did not take much with me. I left the worn-out sofa and the scratched dining table behind. I wanted a completely fresh start. I wanted to build a life that had absolutely no connection to the pain of my past. I moved to a beautiful, quiet coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. I bought a modest, comfortable house with large windows that overlooked the ocean. I did not buy a mansion. I did not buy flashy sports cars or custom emerald velvet furniture. I bought peace. I bought a home where I could wake up every morning and listen to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, knowing that no one could ever take my security away from me again. But I knew I could not just sit on a massive fortune and do nothing. Grandma Beatrice had engineered that poison pill because she believed in my integrity. She trusted me to be the exact opposite of my greedy, toxic parents. She had given me the ultimate weapon to defend myself against family financial abuse, and I knew there were thousands of other people out there suffering in the exact same silent, invisible way I had suffered. 6 months after I moved to the coast, I used a significant portion of the estate funds to establish a nonprofit legal aid organization. I named it the Beatrice Evelyn Foundation. We specifically provide high-tier legal representation and emergency financial planning for victims of familial financial abuse. We help young adults whose parents have stolen their identities or drained their college funds. We help elderly individuals whose children are attempting to illegally seize their assets through fraudulent conservatorships. We fight the exact battles that my grandmother and Thomas Sterling fought for me. We hire aggressive, brilliant attorneys who do not back down from toxic family dynamics. We help victims freeze their compromised accounts, file federal fraud charges against abusive relatives, and secure their independence. Every single time our foundation wins a case and hands a victim back their stolen life, I know I am honoring the legacy of the woman who saved mine. I sit in my bright, sunlit office at the foundation headquarters. The walls are painted a calming shade of blue, and the air smells like fresh coffee and ocean salt. My desk is organized and clean. I do not balance ledgers for ungrateful people anymore. I review legal victories and authorize funding for people who truly need it. On the corner of my mahogany desk sits a simple silver frame. Inside the frame is a photograph of Grandma Beatrice. It was taken many years ago, long before the cancer and the hospice room. She is standing in a beautiful garden, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer, smiling a sharp, confident smile. Her bright blue eyes look directly into the camera, radiating an absolute unyielding strength. I look at that photograph every single morning before I start my work. I trace the edge of the silver frame with my finger, feeling a profound wave of gratitude wash over my entire soul. She saw me when my own parents refused to look at me. She recognized my worth when my sister treated me like dirt. She loved me enough to orchestrate the most brilliant, devastating legal trap in the history of our family, simply to ensure that I would finally be free. I look out the window of my office, watching the gray clouds roll over the deep blue ocean. I take a long, deep breath of the crisp coastal air. My chest does not feel tight anymore. My shoulders are not heavy with the burden of trying to earn love from people who are entirely incapable of giving it. I am surrounded by a team of professionals who respect my leadership. I am doing work that genuinely matters to the world. I am living a life built entirely on truth, integrity, and absolute independence. I smile, leaning back in my chair, finally tasting the sweet, undeniable flavor of absolute freedom. I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am the survivor, and I am exactly the woman my grandmother always knew I could be. Family should be the people who protect you, not the ones who exploit you under the guise of blood. Setting strict boundaries isn't cruel. It is necessary self-defense. If you have ever had to stand your ground against injustice in your own family, hit that like button and subscribe to support stories of truth and justice. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments below. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next story.